6-year-old Adam Walsh and his mother, Rayvay Walsh, were in a Sears in the Hollywood Mall, which is right across the street from the Hollywood, Florida police station. Rayvay allowed Adam to go play in the area with the Atari with a group of boys who were also playing the games, while she went down to the lighting aisle just a few departments down. When she returned less than 10 minutes later, Adam and the other boys were gone. Adam's mother started looking around the store but couldn't find him anywhere. Adam's grandma was also there and assisted Rayvay with her search, but after looking around the entire mall and they still couldn't find him, a teenage security officer that was in the Sears kicked out the boys because they were arguing about whose turn it was to play. Adam was known to be shy, and it's theorized that he was afraid to speak up and follow the group of boys that were getting kicked out. After leaving the store, it is theorized that he was kidnapped outside the store. Adam's parents reported Adam missing, and the police launched a massive search. Missing flyers were handed out everywhere. However, on August 10th, 1981, which is 2 weeks into the search, 2 fishermen found the boy's severed head in a drainage canal in Vero Beach, Florida. To this day, the rest of his body has never been found. The autopsy of the head revealed that the cause of death was asphyxiation, which is the state or process of being deprived of oxygen. It was also said that Adam died days before the head was found. Police would start questioning potential suspects, and they first started with Adam's father, who took a polygraph test, and he passed and was crossed off as a suspect. The same was done to Adam's mother months after his head was found, but she also passed. A week prior to Adam's disappearance, Adam's godfather left the home. Adam's godfather was James Edward Campbell. Campbell was given 2 polygraph tests, and after several questions, he was ruled out. Police would start interviewing inmates, and many of these inmates would just lie, except for a couple that would stand out. In October 1983, a man from Florida named Otis Elwood Toole was an inmate at Rayford, Florida prison. He confessed to abducting and killing Adam. He also said that Henry Lee Lucas, who was a serial killer during the 1960s to the 80s, was part of the crime. However, it was proved that Lucas wasn't a part of the murder since he was in jail in Virginia at the time of Adam's murder and abduction. Otis told the police where the body was at, but police couldn't find it, which made them believe that Otis wasn't a part of the murder. Due to them not finding any physical evidence, the Florida state attorney couldn't prosecute the case. In the months that followed, Otis retracted his confession, but then in the years that followed, he said he did kill Adam. However, Elwood wasn't the only suspect in the case. The other one was Jeffrey Dahmer, who was living in Florida when Adam was abducted. Also, it was revealed that Dahmer was working really close to the mall and could have easily went to abduct him. Also, using public records, the account of 2 witnesses said that a thin blonde man was at the mall acting strange. In 1992, Florida police went to go interview Dahmer, who denied killing him. However, a former FBI agent said that Dahmer privately gave a hint to killing Adam. However, this didn't lead anywhere, and eventually the case went cold.
Police in Hollywood, Florida are holding a news conference where they're expecting to announce a break in the case.
Eventually, in 2008, the family of Adam Walsh would get the conclusion to this case. The conclusion was that Otis Elwood Toole was the killer. According to Adam's father, John Walsh, he said, "We believed for years that Otis Toole killed Adam." It was revealed that at Otis's home, there were green shorts and a sandal, which was similar to what Adam was wearing when he disappeared. This case changed a lot for helping with missing cases. The case helped for faces being put on milk cartons. It also started the TV show called America's Most Wanted, and in 2006, President George W. Bush signed the Adam Walsh Child Protection Act, which started the National Sex Offender Registry. However, with this case, a lot of people think this has been a cover-up, and police kind of rushed to convict a person for this case. It's March 28, 1966. 17-year-old senior Danny Goldman is living with his parents in their home in Surfside, Florida. However, that night, Danny was abducted by an intruder in his own home. For years, this case has been unsolved, and to this day still is. Danny was known to enjoy electronics, specifically working on television sets. Danny also loved spending time with his girlfriend, Sharon Lloyd. Aaron Goldman, his father, was a contractor and builder who was very successful. Stella Goldman, his mother, was an interior designer. On March 29, 1966, Danny was planning on celebrating his 18th birthday and was also planning on registering to the Selective Service Office with his mother. However, the day before, at 4:30 a.m., the sliding glass door to the home was unlocked by an individual. The intruder came in and addressed each family member in the house by their first names. He tied up Sally and Aaron and demanded $10,000, which would be over $93,000 in today's money. However, the intruder only found some money in Aaron's wallet. He took that, and Danny money with him. He told the family that the starting ransom amount would be $25,000. However, if they couldn't get it by 6 p.m. that evening, he would double it to $50,000. After this, the abductor didn't contact the family, and the family never gave the abductor money. After the abduction, police came to the Goldman home and started investigating. They found a fingerprint of a surgical glove. It was believed that the abductor might have cut part of the glove off by accident. It turns out the glove was a medical glove, most likely being made in Canada. Being made in Canada, you couldn't buy this glove in the United States. It is theorized that the glove was most likely stolen from someone's briefcase. As soon as this was figured out, the Surfside, Florida police alerted the Canada Medical Association with a description of the abductor. As far as what this abductor looked like, Aaron said he wasn't able to get a good look at him. However, he said he might have known the man. He was described by Aaron as a Caucasian male with a Midwestern accent. Being around 5'8" to 5'11", he looked to weigh about 180 to 200 pounds. He had gray hair and was also wearing glasses with silver rims. He was wearing a baseball cap and he was wearing darker clothes and was most likely in his 50s. However, this case was never solved, and a childhood friend of Danny, David Grobart, said that the days became weeks and the weeks became months. We thought he would be back in 2 or 3 days somehow with this crazy story to tell. It's New Year's Eve 1981. 15-year-old Charlie Hall, who lived in northern Nashville, left his mother's apartment to go over to his ex-girlfriend's house at around 3 p.m. Soon after he left, his mother, Mildred Carwell, went to the grocery store, and when she came back, she found that her son wasn't back home yet. It turns out that Charlie went over to try to convince her to change her mind about the breakup. At around 5 p.m., he left his girlfriend's house crying, with her not agreeing for them getting back together. She asked him where he was going before he left, and according to her, Charles said, "Don't worry about it." Charles didn't take any clothes or 2 of his favorite things, which was his bike and his tape recorder. His family said that Charles was not the type to just run away and disappear for a few days and then come back. It might have not been his breakup that was just affecting him, but also at the time of his disappearance, his parents were divorced, which could have had an effect on him. Unfortunately, there wasn't any details of where he could have gone, and to this day, this case still remains unsolved. It's a cold, snowy night in Ellenville, New York. Joseph David Held, who was 17, and 3 of his other friends, Wade Marks, Kelly Diaz, and John LaForge, were hanging out in an abandoned ski lodge, Mount Cathalia. It was January 16, 1987, and the group decided they were going to go on a drive at LaForge's Subaru during the night. That night, when the 4 of them were on their drive, their car got stuck in the snow at around 3:30 a.m. on January 17, 1987. All 4 of them attempted to push the car out of the snow, but they were unable to do so. Joseph decided to walk to a nearby village, which is around 5 miles away. Soon after Joseph left, the group left the car to try to get to safety. All of them made to safety. However, Joseph still wasn't with them. They thought that he went home, but a call that took place the next day said otherwise. It was the evening of January 17, 1987. It was around 5:30 p.m. when Joseph's boss at the auction barn, which is Joseph's place of employment, called Joseph's mother, Lee Ann Houseman, and reported that Joseph didn't show up to work. Lee thought this was odd behavior because she knew that he would never skip work. Joseph's family began to worry about Joseph when he didn't show up that same evening. Joe's aunt said that they told me that Joe hadn't shown up for work that night, and well, I just got this sinking feeling. At that moment, I knew, I don't know how, but I knew something bad had happened. On January 17th, the family reported Joseph missing, and that weekend a massive search was launched by the Ellenville Police Department. However, soon after the search was launched, it expanded to the New York State Police. Helicopters and police dogs were used to locate Joseph, and they were looking all over. They even went as far as looking into caves. Fortunately, the search would be called off until the spring due to the cold and snowy weather conditions. However, when they picked it back up, due to the period of time that passed since Joseph's disappearance, there was no trace of Joseph anywhere. On December 8, 2004, a band known as Damage Plan were playing at the El Rosa Villa nightclub in Columbus, Ohio. The band started the gig with their song known as Breathing New Life. They started playing, but soon after they started, former Marine Nathan Gale, who was 6'5", jumped over the 7.5-foot wall of amps and ran across the stage carrying a Beretta 9mm handgun and shot guitarist Daryl Lance Abbott, or known by his stage name Dimebag Daryl, in the back of the head 3 times and shot him in the hand once. Gale kept firing as members of the band charged him. Gale ended up killing 3 other people and injuring 2 other people. He also took the band's drum tech John Nat Brooks as his hostage. Eventually, Officer James Nigmeyer showed up to the scene without backup and shot and killed Gale. It turns out that Gale had 35 rounds left, which means he probably wanted to kill more people. At first, police thought the reason Gale shot Daryl was that he thought that Daryl caused the breakup of his favorite band, Pantera. However, the police investigation revealed that Gale was a schizophrenic and thought that members of Pantera were stealing his thoughts. Unfortunately, the officer who killed Gale developed PTSD from the incident, which led to him leaving the police force. In 2011, he got a civilian job and was still seeing a counselor from the trauma he experienced on that day in 2004. Daryl is considered to be one of the greatest guitarists, and next year will be the 20-year anniversary of his passing and the other victims' passings. On May 28, 1977, singer and actor John Davidson was performing at the Beverly Hills Supper Club in Southgate, Kentucky. Davidson was performing in the Caribet Room, which was full of people. In fact, the amount of people in the room passed the fire code limit. At 8:30 p.m., a wedding reception ended in the Zebra Room of the club. Participants in the wedding complained that the room smelled smoky and was also just warm. Just before 9 p.m., an employee also smelled the smoke and opened the Zebra Room, which was stupid. Because of this, the oxygen in the Zebra Room gravitated toward the ceiling, which caused a fire. As the fire spread, employees urged participants to leave the building. However, since the building was overcrowded, it blocked exits and prevented people from leaving. In the Caribet Room, the people in there were just panicked, which led to even more people getting trapped, which unfortunately led to their deaths. At around midnight, the roof of the building collapsed, and finally, at 2 a.m., the fire was under control. Unfortunately, the flames of the fire killed 165 people, and the majority of the victims died in the Caribet Room. Luckily, Davidson escaped out of a back door that led to the dressing room. An investigation revealed that the fire was not caused intentionally. However, the result of this led to a movement to improve fire codes in the U.S. The family's victims received $30 million in first-class action, which led to a lawsuit. The lawsuit resulted in a settlement of $6.7 million. The property where the former supper club stood turned into apartments and complexes, and where the Caribet Room stood was turned into a fountain in memorial of the 165 victims of this deadly fire. It's August 8, 1992. A concert that had high anticipation hit Montreal, Canada. Two of the most famous bands, Guns N' Roses and Metallica, were playing at Olympic Stadium. After the opening band performed, Metallica came on. It was during their song Fade to Black when everything went to hell. Frontman James Hetfield was standing on top of a pyro grate when it went off. Basically, since he walked in the flames, he received second and third degree burns on his arm and hand. Immediately after the accident, Hetfield was rushed to the hospital, and the stage faded to black also immediately after the incident. But this was even the worst part. Guns N' Roses were supposed to play, but there was a 3-hour break in between sets because of the accident. Guns N' Roses entered the stage, however, there were sound problems, and also Axl Rose, one of the band members, left early because of a sore throat. Fans started a riot by going into the street and flipping over cars, smashing windows, stole from stores, and even set fires. Police eventually showed up and stopped the riot. However, by the time they showed up, the damage had been very expensive. After the incident, Metallica blamed Guns N' Roses for causing the fire, and Guns N' Roses guitarist wrote in his book that it was actually a huge issue for me because I lost face with everyone in Metallica. On October 6, 1992, the tour ended and the two bands stopped playing together. On June 30th, 2000, a massive crowd of people formed to see Pearl Jam at Denmark's Roskilde Festival. Eventually the show started and it was great until an hour in. 8 men from the ages 17 to 26 were killed from suffocation in a mosh pit. Another man died at the hospital 5 days later. 26 other people were injured. Unfortunately, the chaos of the concert got very out of control, and unfortunately it caused the 9 deaths of this concert. According to singer of the band Eddie Vedder, he said that the band didn't even know what was happening until it was too late. They figured out what was happening when somebody from the crowd was pulled off to the side whose skin was blue. It is also theorized that there was wet mud on the ground, which might have caused some people to slip and cause their injuries. A report came out that Pearl Jam was morally wrong for the incident. However, Pearl Jam argued that all the deaths and injuries from this weren't all accidents. They also said if they were informed of what was happening, they would have stopped the show and more people could have been saved. In 2020, the band posted a tribute for the 20-year anniversary of this tragedy. To this day, the band is still together and they still tour. On August 13th, 2011, the National Weather Service was warning Indiana of a thunderstorm. However, during this time, the Indiana State Fair was going on. At 8:45 p.m., a band known as Sugarland was scheduled to perform at the fair. However, at 8 p.m., Cindy Hoy, who was the executive director of the Indiana State Fair Commission, had a meeting to go over the weather conditions. The storm was expected to start in the area of the fair at 9:15 p.m. Cindy said she wanted to delay the concert until the storm passed. The message was passed on to Sugarland's managers, but they wanted to start the scheduled time. Now, the only thing that the managers were informed of was that it was only supposed to rain, and they were never informed that there was supposed to be a storm. At 8:30 p.m., Cindy met up with the state police captain, Brad Weaver, who told Cindy that he was concerned about the upcoming weather conditions. Weaver told Sydney that she should cancel the concert, and there should also be an escape plan for the crowd. Sydney took Wheeler's advice about preparing an evacuation, but did not cancel the show. At 8:39 p.m., the National Weather Service warned the area of strong winds and severe hail. However, both Sydney and Weaver didn't receive this message. At 8:45 p.m., the announcer told the crowd that there was a storm coming. However, the show would still continue, and they also told the crowd how to evacuate the area in worst-case scenario. The concert was set to start at 8:50 p.m. However, at 8:46 p.m., a massive gust of wind hit the stage and caused it to collapse. This accident killed 7 people and injured 58. The investigation revealed that the concert barriers and tension cables that held up the stage were not tight. After this horrible incident, a lawsuit took place, which led to a $50 million settlement. The Clutter family were a family who lived in Holcomb, Kansas. Holcomb is and was a very small town of less than 300 people in 1959. The Clutters lived in a large farmhouse with 14 rooms. Bonnie Clutter, who was 45, was married to 48-year-old Herbert Clutter, and they had 4 kids. The family was very rich after Herbert made a machine to grow wheat. It became revolutionary, and eventually the New York Times interviewed him about his invention. Herbert and Bonnie had 2 kids who were adults, Beverly and Avenna. Their other 2 kids were Nancy and Kenyon. Nancy was 16 and she loved to bake, loved riding horses, and was dating a boy, Bob Rupp. Kenyon, who was 15, was skilled at woodworking around the house and the farm. While having a smaller build and poor eyesight, Kenyon was also good at basketball and baseball for his high school teams. Unfortunately, after her children were born, Bonnie battled crippling depression, which was so bad that it left her bedridden. However, Bonnie would sometimes participate in local garden clubs. Holcomb was a town where everyone knew each other, and the Clutters were an honorable family, and Herb was known as the salt of the earth. However, Holcomb being a small town, everyone knew that the Clutters were wealthy. Meanwhile, 300 miles away, Richard Hickok, who was 33 years old, cellmate at Kansas State Prison, had heard about the Clutters and their wealth from his cellmate Floyd Wells. Wells had previously worked for the family on their farm and knew about their riches. Specifically, he told Richard that Herbert had a safe with $10,000 in it. Richard was in prison for theft. However, even being in prison, he planned on how he was going to rob the Clutters. After this, Richard wrote a letter to Perry Smith, who was a former cellmate. Perry was recently released from the prison and wanted to help Richard once he was released in November 1959. On November 14th, 4 of the family members were home, which was Herbert, Bonnie, Nancy, and Kenyon. That night, Richard and Perry drove past the home and waited for the family to go to sleep. Before driving past the home, Richard and Perry got everything for the murder, which was a shotgun, flashlight, a knife, and gloves. Eventually, the family went to sleep. Luckily for the robbers, one of the doors to the house was unlocked. However, their entrance to the house woke up Herbert. After waking him up, the robbers ordered Herbert to tell them where the safe was. However, the robbers learned that Herbert didn't even own a safe. It turns out they were both misled. Herbert was always known to pay with a check instead of cash. However, this information didn't stop both of the robbers to go to each room and search for valuables. They only got a little bit of cash of $50, binoculars, and a transitor radio. The 2 robbers thought that Herbert was holding information about more cash or valuables, so they decided they would murder him and the other family members. The next day, 2 of Nancy's classmates, Susan Kidwell and Nancy Eatwalt, found the bodies. Eventually, when officers arrived, Herbert was discovered lying on a mattress in the basement with his mouth taped shut, stabbed, and a gunshot wound to his head. In the same room, Kenyon was also bound, gagged, and shot in the head. Bonnie and Nancy were found in separate rooms upstairs. Bonnie was bound and gagged, and Nancy was only bound. However, both of them had a gunshot wound to the head. Chief Mitchell Geisler and Assistant Chief Rich Rodletter were one of the first cops to arrive at the scene. Rich was also an excellent photographer and would document the scene with photos. Bloody footprints, which would be hard to see, would be discovered, which connected to Perry. Another photo revealed tire tracks of the vehicle leaving the scene. Alvin Dewey of the KBI would lead the investigation. There are also 4 other investigators working with him. Right after the murders, the 2 murderers would flee to the Kansas City area, which was around 6 hours away from Holcomb, which led to them fleeing to Mexico, where they would live for a brief period of time. They would sell the binoculars they stole at a pawn shop and hitchhike their way through California, all the way to Omaha, Nebraska. However, they would relocate to Iowa, where they would steal a car and return to Kansas City. However, after spending a short amount of time at Kansas City, they would travel to Florida and Nevada. They would get arrested on December 31st, 1959, after an over 6-week-long run from the police. The 2 were still driving the stolen car from Iowa when they were discovered. While they were on the run, the police were able to connect evidence together from Floyd Wells, who snitched on them for the murders. The shoe print would match up with the boots that the 2 had in their possession. Once they were captured, the KBI investigators flew out to Nevada, where the criminals would give a confession. After the confession, the two were flown out to Garden City, Kansas. A trial would be held at the Finney County District Court. The court decided on the two men being guilty of the murders and were given the death penalty. They were put on death row at the federal prison in Leavenworth, Kansas for 5 years. Eventually, on April 14, 1965, the two men would be hanged. At 12:41 a.m., Richard would die, and at 1:19, Perry died. The two were buried at Mount Munchie Cemetery. Floyd Wells would later commit suicide in a cell in Mississippi. On May 4th, 1982, Maura Murray was born as the youngest daughter to parents Fred and Laura Murray in Brockton, Massachusetts. She was raised in Hanson, Massachusetts with her 4 other siblings. Her family described her as being great at academics, an overachiever, and being a great athlete. She took on several sports like running and basketball. Eventually, after graduating high school, she would receive many offers from different colleges. However, she would eventually attend the U.S. Military Academy at West Point, New York, because her sister Julie was already registered there. When she was a sophomore, she realized that the military wasn't for her. Maura would transfer to a different school in her sophomore year of college to Amherst, Massachusetts to study nursing. On February 9, 2004, Murray would do her morning routine of submitting her homework electronically. After submitting her homework, she would reach out to her professors through email. She would say that someone had passed away in her family and she would have to leave campus for a week. However, at that time, no one had passed away in their family. After signing these emails, she would call the owner of a condo in Bartlett, New Hampshire, which her family said was a place that she would spend her time at. She would proceed to pack her bags with clothes that were meant to last several days. She would also pack school books, makeup, toiletries, and workout clothes. At 3:15 p.m., Maura would be at an ATM around campus withdrawing $280, which is about all of the funds she had in that account. After withdrawing the money, she would spend about $40 at the liquor store and would flee the area at around 4:30 p.m., heading to New Hampshire in her 1996 black Saturn sedan. Her family also said that she didn't tell anybody about her plan that day. Between 7 to 7:30 p.m., a bus driver whose name was Butch Atwood was driving his bus in Haverhill, New Hampshire. As he drove, he spotted a crashed car stuck in a ditch on Route 112. He would also notice that the woman was standing right by the crashed car. Atwood would stop and try to help the woman by calling authorities. However, she would decline and say that a car company was coming to help her. Atwood would drive home, but ignoring Maura's request, he would call authorities at around 7:42 p.m. He told authorities that Maura seemed shaken, but there weren't any visible injuries on Maura. However, it turns out that 7:27 p.m., another resident had already called about the crash on Route 112. At around 7:45 p.m., an officer would arrive at the crash site. However, Maura was nowhere to be seen. The officer would study the car and notice that the front of the car was severely damaged, and also noticed that the car had been locked, and behind the front seat there was a box of red wine. According to the family, there were red stains on the front door and ceiling of the car. There was also a Coca-Cola bottle with red liquid on it. Atwood would arrive at the crime scene and would try to search with an officer for Maura, but they had no luck. Her cell phone and wallet were taken from the car, but everything else was in the car. Also, during that time, there wasn't any activity in her bank accounts or her cell phone. Tracker dogs were sent out to look for Maura's scent, and they found it, but they lost her scent just within 100 yards. Atwood did say that Maura seemed intoxicated when she was last seen. Police thought that Maura hitchhiked a ride and drove away from the scene. There was also not any sign of a fight or struggle, and on top of that, there was also not any footprints in the snow. After the disappearance, police would search Maura's computer, which led to them finding that she was searching for hotel rooms in Burlington, Vermont. Police would look for her in Burlington, however there wasn't any trace of her. In March 2004, a woman who resembled Maura went missing in the New England area. It turns out the identity of this woman is Brianna Maitland. They're both known as being brunette, and both of their vehicles were left behind with their personal items in it. However, both cases have not been connected. It was also revealed that 2 days before Maura went missing, she crashed her father's vehicle. Luckily, she was okay after the crash, but there are damages on the car which were thousands of dollars. Shortly after the crash, she was arrested after she used a stolen credit card number to order food. However, the charges were dropped because of good behavior in jail. Her father doesn't think the incidents are related. It also turns out that at the time of her disappearance, Maura was in a relationship with her boyfriend Billy Rossich, and some people even say that the two might have been engaged. However, Maura was having an affair with her track coach, Hossen Bagati. Hossen said that Maura told him that Billy was controlling, and later Billy was charged with felony on sex abuse by a grand jury. However, the internet has made a theory that she could have been kidnapped and unfortunately murdered. Now, the reason is because on the exact date that Maura went missing 8 years later, on February 9th, 2012, an account named 112 Dirtbag uploaded this video. Now, what connections does this video have to the case? while Route 112 is where Maura went missing, and Maura's father said that whoever kidnapped Maura is a dirtbag. And if you already couldn't tell, the happy anniversary at the end of the video stands for the date that Maura disappeared. You're also probably wondering, well, who made this video? And that belongs to Alden Olson, who is from Massachusetts, which is where her college was. However, this video didn't make Alden a suspect, and the video wasn't used as evidence. It also turns out that Alden owns a blog where he tries to solve the case. Unfortunately, this case remains open to this day. There have been 2 incidents where there's slight hope that she could be found, but unfortunately those have been cold. Julie, her sister, has seemed to accept that her sister might be gone. However, she has made a TikTok account about Maura. Dorothy Arnold was born on July 1st, 1885 in New York City. She was the second child to parents Frances Rose Arnold and Mary Martha Parks Arnold. The Arnold family were known as wealthy for being in the business of good imports like perfume. Dorothy would go to Bryn Mawr College to study literature and language, and she would also be in the graduating class of 1905. After graduating college, she would move back to New York City to pursue a career in writing. Dorothy would try to apply to magazine companies to get her work out into the world. However, she would face rejection. Her rejections caused her friends and family to tease her about not being able to get a job as a writer. Because of this, Dorothy would open a private mailbox for her application results to avoid being teased if she failed again. Unfortunately, Dorothy would never be accepted as a writer for a profession. However, with this lack of success, Dorothy was viewed from the outside as a happy person. At 11 in the morning of December 12, 1910, Dorothy would make her way down the stairs of her family home to go tell her mother, Martha, that today she was going to go shopping to find a dress for her sister's party, which her name was Marjorie, which is scheduled on the 17th of that month. Martha was sick at that time, but she was willing to go with Dorothy. She told Dorothy that she wanted to come, but for some reason Dorothy said, "No, Mother, don't bother. You don't feel just right, and it's no use going to the trouble. I mightn't see the thing I want, but if I do, I'll phone you." When Dorothy left, she was carrying $25 of her $100 allowance. However, the day before, she withdrew $36 from the bank to be able to afford lunch for her friends at a restaurant called Sherry's. And she might have been carrying her nightgown, but she might have been hiding it in her muffs. After Dorothy left, she went to a candy store called Parks and Tilford's to purchase a half-pound of chocolates. Right after, Dorothy would make her way down the icy streets of New York City to 27th Street. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Dorothy was standing outside talking to a friend named Gladys Kane outside Brentano's bookshop, which is located at 5th Avenue and 27th Street. However, after talking to her friend, she made her way to Central Park, and this would be the last time she would be seen. Gladys would say after talking to Dorothy, she seemed in a good and happy mood, and there seemed that there wasn't anything wrong with her. Dorothy was last seen wearing a well-tailored suit, a blue coat, a skirt, a black hat with roses for decoration, and a handbag. That night, when she didn't make it back for dinner without giving her family any warning, they got worried. They would make phone calls to Dorothy's close friends, but they hadn't seen her. However, one of Dorothy's friends, Elise Henry, who was called by the family, would call back after midnight. She would ask if Dorothy returned, and Miss Arnold would say yes, she's here. Elise would ask to speak to Dorothy, but Miss Arnold would say that she had a headache and went to bed. However, in reality, Dorothy wasn't there at all. It is still unknown why Miss Arnold lied about Dorothy making it back home. The next morning, when Dorothy still hadn't come home, Mr. Arnold called their lawyer and family friend John S. Keith. John would search Dorothy's room and found nothing out of the ordinary except there were some burnt papers in the fireplace. Dorothy didn't take anything that would help her run away or anything valuable from her room. When she went missing, Dorothy had a boyfriend who was 42-year-old George Grimson Jr., who is an engineer. They met at Bryn Mawr when Dorothy was attending. Dorothy's parents didn't support the relationship. Mr. and Mrs. Arnold didn't want George as a son-in-law because of the 17-year age gap, and also George seemed kinda lazy. A year before Dorothy went missing, she would lie to her parents by saying that she was going to see an old college friend. However, in reality, she went all the way to Boston to see George, and after Mr. and Mrs. Arnold realized what she was really doing, they forbade her from seeing George. The Arnolds suspected that George was in on Dorothy being missing. However, their theory was quickly disproved when they found out that George was in Italy when she went missing. On December 16th, 1910, the Arnolds sent a telegraph to George in Italy asking if he knew where Dorothy was, but he said that he had no idea where Dorothy was. However, George's answer didn't make them believe that he was innocent, so Miss Arnold and Dorothy's brother John flew out to Florence, Italy to go to the hotel that George was staying at. However, when they talked to George in person, he said that he loved Dorothy, but he didn't know where she went. Apparently, John John wasn't having it that day because John KO'd George right in the jaw. Meanwhile, John Keith was back in New York City trying to figure out the case. Keith would search hospitals, morgues, and even ship ports for Dorothy, but nothing came up. Keith needed more help, so I called George S. Doughtery, who was the head of the Pinkerton Detective Agency, who would start a private investigation. Still at this time, Mr. Arnold didn't call the police about his missing daughter because Mr. Arnold didn't want to make it known to the public for some reason. The investigation continued for 6 weeks, and finally, in mid-January of 1911, police were called, but even with the police helping, they still couldn't find anything. Police would suggest that the Arnolds have a press conference about Dorothy, so on January 25th, 1911, a press conference would be held at Mr. Arnold's office, and the Arnolds would hold a $1,000 reward if they found her, which would be over $32,000 in today's money. Dorothy's disappearance was all over the US and newspapers. There are thousands of tips or reports of sightings of Dorothy, which were all fake. During this time, when the case was all over America, the Arnold family received 2 ransom notes, demanding $5,000 to get Dorothy back, and also threatening Marjorie, Dorothy's sister. However, to this day, this case is still unsolved. On April 10th, 1928, 2 newlyweds, Glenn and Bessie Hyde, were going to their honeymoon that would be at the Grand Canyon. The two had met on a boat to Los Angeles in 1927. The two had an instant connection. When the two met, Bessie was married. However, the day before Glenn and Bessie got married, her divorce was finalized. The reason they chose the Grand Canyon was because Glenn wanted to set the record for the fastest time to go through the canyon, and if they completed the journey, it would make Bessie a celebrity because she'd be the first woman to complete the trail. On October 20th of that year, the two would start the first part of their journey on Glenn's scow that he made. A scow is basically a boat. They would start from Green River, Utah, with the goal of arriving at Needles, California by early December. After 26 days, the couple would make it to Bright Angel Trail, where they would go to visit photographer Emery Kolb. Emery would notice that the couple wasn't carrying life jackets on the boat, and he also said that their boat wasn't safe for the winter, and they should stay with him until the winter is over. Emery offered them life jackets, but Glenn would not only decline the life jackets, but he would also decline staying with Emery for the winter. Emery also noticed that Bessie seemed done with the trip and didn't want to go back out onto the water. On November 18th, still ignoring Emery's advice, the couple would go back onto the water. However, one of Emery's friends, Adolph G. Sutra, would travel with the couple for several miles until they reached Hermit Rapid, which is when Adolph would leave the couple. Adolph would be the last person to see the couple alive. On December 6th, Glenn's father was waiting for his son to return home from his almost 2-month-long journey. However, both Glenn and Bessie were nowhere to be seen. Because of this, Glenn's father would report them missing, and 2 Army observation planes were sent out from Marchfield to Riverside, California to go look for the couple. On December 19th, the couple's boat was located on mile 237. The boat was sat upright, with supplies being strapped in place. Both Bessie and Glenn weren't on the boat. There also weren't any footprints on the boat either. Unfortunately, this case remained unsolved until 1971. On a commercial Grand Canyon trip, an older woman was one of the passengers. While she and the other passengers and guides were sitting around the campfire talking about the Hydes going missing, she said that she was Bessie Hyde. She continued talking, and the other passengers had mixed emotions. She said what really had happened was Glenn was abusive, and she had finally stabbed him, which could have been the real reason why she didn't want to go back out on the boat. She said after she stabbed him, she would flee the boat and would escape the canyon entirely. However, the woman's claims of Glenn being abusive is not a certain fact. Eventually, the woman's claim would change once officials found her. She basically played dumb and said she had no idea what they were talking about. In 1992, famous rafter Georgie Clark, who had passed away that year, was thought to be Bessie Hyde. There are some documents that she had, which included a copy of Bessie and Glenn's marriage certificate. However, there weren't any evidence that she was in fact Bessie Hyde. Another big break would come in the case when in 1976, the skeletal remains of a young male would be found in the canyon. Theorists would jump to the conclusion that it was Glenn Hyde's remains. It also turns out that a bullet was found in the skull of the remains, which led to people thinking that both of them had been shot, and Emery Kolb had something to do with the murder. Even further proving this theory, it turns out there were skeletal remains on his property. However, this was disproved when the body turned out to be no older than 22 years old, while Glenn was 29 when he went missing. Also, the person who died would have died around or after 1972. To this day, this case remains unsolved. Etta Ryle was born on May 4th, 1914 in Providence, Rhode Island, to parents Joseph Ryle and Rose Ryle. Etta went to Oxford High School in Oxford, Massachusetts. While she was there, she met her boyfriend, Henry Solon. However, after they graduated, Etta would find out she was pregnant. Etta said that the baby's father belonged to Henry, and she would file a paternity suit against him. Etta was going to Worcester State Teachers College at the time, and Henry was going to Bates College in Maine, so the two weren't even in the same state. However, the two kept in contact. In September of 1934, Etta's daughter, Alma, was born. Fast forward to 2 months after Alma was born on November 21st, 1934. Etta was thinking about the paternity suit that was happening the next day. She seemed anxious and depressed about it until an evening that she spent with Henry on a drive in his car. After she got back from the drive, she seemed really happy because she said that she and Henry were getting married. She also told her sister that she was going up to New York City that night. Etta packed a small bag and wasn't bringing Alma along. However, she did say she would come back within the week for Alma. Sometime after midnight, a police officer saw Henry's car parked outside of Etta and her family's home. Etta would come out of her home and leave with Henry in his car. This would be the last time anyone would see Etta Ryle. Later that day on the 22nd, Etta's paternity suit was scheduled for that day. However, Etta was nowhere to be seen. That day, Etta's sister would run into Henry and she would ask him why he and Etta decided to get married and about the trip to New York City all of a sudden. Henry would say that he knew nothing about them getting married, and also he said he knew nothing about the New York City trip. Henry would say that he dropped off Etta at Worcester's Union Station in Worcester, Massachusetts. Henry didn't know where she went. Etta was reported missing and police would go to Henry since he was the last person to see her. Henry would tell police that Etta falsely accused him of being the father of her child. Henry would also mention to police how Etta seemed apprehensive about the paternity suit. Henry thought that Etta may have been sued. A letter that Etta wrote to her friends would support this theory. From the research I did, I couldn't find anything about what the letter said. On December 2nd, Etta's attorney received a telegram that was signed by Etta. The letter would give directions to stop the paternity test against Henry. Police would look deeper into the telegram, and it turns out that it was ordered by a payphone in New York City, and to this day, the identity of this person remains unknown. Police would go to Worcester's Union Station, where Henry supposedly dropped off Etta at. It turns out the day of Etta's disappearance, the train dispatcher received 3 phone calls between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m. from an unlisted number. 2 of the calls were from the same man, and the third call was from a woman. 2 people were saying that they wanted the staff to prevent Etta from getting on the train, and they wanted them to find her. On the third call, the woman calling said that she was the Oxford switchboard operator. However, it turns out the woman was lying because that night the switchboard operator that was on duty was male. To this day, the 2 people who made these calls remain unknown. A full search was done on the station, and Etta was nowhere to be seen. In 1935, the police started diving deeper into this case. They questioned more people about the case and connections to the case. One person that police interviewed was a man whose identity is unknown. He was from Putnam, Connecticut, and seemed close to Etta. He seemed even more suspicious because at the time of Etta's disappearance, he went to Florida with someone whose identity also remains unknown. However, he was ruled out. In August of that year, a woman said she had shared an apartment with Etta in Boston. However, the same woman was eventually moved to a psychiatric hospital, which means she was probably lying. There were many other incidents of people coming forward with information, however, they all didn't lead anywhere. In the years after the disappearance, police suspected that Etta was secretly buried at Oxford Cemetery. Graves were searched between 1935 and 1937, but her remains were never discovered. This case became famous across the U.S. The case was included in a New York City program called the War Radio Mystery Stories program. 56 years later, Etta's case was brought back to light when Alma, Etta's daughter, filed a paternity test against Henry. She said that she wanted Henry to be labeled as her legal father. However, in 1993, her case was dismissed. Unfortunately, Alma passed away in 2006, not knowing what happened to her mother. To this day, this case remains unsolved. Glenn Miller was born in Iowa on March 1st, 1904. He spent the later part of his childhood in Fort Morgan in Colorado. In high school, he played football and trombone, which he had a talent for. After graduating, he would attend the University of Colorado. However, he would eventually drop out to pursue a career in music. Luckily, his career in music would be successful. He had a hit called In the Mood that was released in 1939. During World War II, Glenn was traveling across Europe performing concerts for the soldiers. On December 15th, 1944, Glenn was finished performing for soldiers in England. He was going to board a plane to France with his orchestra. Glenn and 2 crew members would board an aircraft called the UC-64A Norseman on the same day. On December 18th, Glenn was nowhere to be seen and hadn't met up with his orchestra for rehearsals. However, the members of the orchestra weren't concerned. They thought that the weather conditions or the war delayed their arrival. On December 27th, Glenn had still not shown up and was reported missing. The investigation revealed that the plane never made it to France. Without any evidence in France, the investigation would move to England where Glenn was last seen. The police found out that two of the other crew members that Glenn traveled with were John Morgan and Norman F. Bassell. The day they left, the path that they were taking showed that there was heavy fog. It turns out that John wasn't even certified to fly, so it was concluded that John was having trouble seeing and the plane crashed into the English Channel. There have been many theories, even going as far as Glenn might have faked his death. However, to this day, the remains of the plane have not been found, and also Glenn hasn't been found. However, if you Google Glenn Miller, it says he passed away on December 15th, 1944. Lawrence Joseph Bader was born on December 2nd, 1926 in Akron, Ohio. His father was a dentist, and Joseph was inspired by his father and also wanted to become a dentist. However, instead, Joseph would join the Navy in 1944. After serving for 2 years, he would enroll in the University of Akron. While he was only there for 1 semester, he did meet his future wife, Mary Lou Knapp. They got married on April 19th, 1952. 5 years after the couple married, they already had 3 children and were expecting a 4th. On May 15th, 1957, Joseph was going on a business trip to Cleveland, Ohio. He told his wife that afterwards he was going to go on a fishing trip. Mary would ask if he was going to come straight home after the fishing trip, to which he would reply by saying, "Maybe I will and maybe I won't." After driving to Cleveland, he would pay off some bills and would cash in a $400 check. After this, he would travel to Ohio's Rocky River, which is off from Lake Erie. However, that day that Joseph was going fishing, he was told 2 times that a storm was coming. The first time was by the owner of a boathouse, who was Lawrence Coltalor, and the second time was a Coast Guard who saw him on the water. According to Lawrence, when Joseph was renting the boat, he had a suitcase with him. Joseph was renting a boat that came with lights. However, it wouldn't have been dark for a while at that time. Joseph would take the boat on the water, and the Coast Guard who saw him would be the last person to see Joseph. The storm would occur that day, and the next morning Joseph's boat was found 5 miles away. Joseph was nowhere to be seen, as along with his suitcase. However, the boat seemed fine with only a bent propeller and a scratch. The life jacket was on the boat still, and some reports state that the gas was empty or the gas line was completely disconnected. A search for Joseph was conducted for 2 months. However, he was declared dead in 1960. However, something strange would happen on either May 18th or May 20th of 1957. A guy who is described as being charming would walk into a bar in Omaha, Nebraska to request a job. He had a suitcase with him and a Navy-issued driver's license. He said that his name was John Fritz Johnson. John would say that he served for 14 years but was released after having a bad back. A lot of people took a liking to John, and he got a job as a bartender and became a local celebrity. He was very outgoing and had a passion for archery. He would also get married to Nancy Zimmer, who was a former model, which led to John adopting her daughter, and they would also have a child together. He would eventually do a fundraising event for charity. He would sit on a flagpole for 15 or 30 days to raise money for a virus called polio. He would eventually become a radio personality for the radio station called KBON. Eventually, on February 2nd, 1965, a 21-year-old named Suzanne Pica got a phone call telling her to come to a sporting goods show in Chicago. The caller was apparently an acquaintance to Lawrence, who was her uncle. She would eventually arrive at the show, which is where John was giving a demonstration about archery stuff. John was wearing an eye patch and had a mustache, but Suzanne would recognize him as her deceased uncle. After his presentation, Suzanne would go up to John and ask him, "Pardon me, but aren't you my uncle, Larry Bader, who disappeared 7 years ago?" John would laugh at the question, but she was convinced that he was Lawrence. Eventually, a finger comparison would be tested, and Lawrence and John were a match, which made John Fritz Johnson's real identity Lawrence Joseph Bader. According to John, he had no memory of his past of being Lawrence. This discovery led to John being held under 10 days of medical observation. The doctors couldn't find anything about him lying about this. However, there weren't any leads that doctors could find. On September 16th, 1966, John or Lawrence Joseph Bader would die of a tumor.
Why must I see shadows?
In January of 1966, a new Prime Minister would be elected for Australia. This new Prime Minister would replace the loyal and the country's longest-serving leader, John Warhurst. His name was Harold Holt, and while not being in office for a while, he made changes, like changing the money currency to dollars and cents. On December 17th, 1967, it was a nice day to go swimming. Before lunch, Holt was going to the beach near his holiday home at Portsea on the Victorian coast. Holt did enjoy swimming, however, he wasn't the strongest swimmer. He also wasn't in the best health after just having shoulder surgery. The doctor said not to do some crazy shit like swimming, which is what he was going to do. He also played tennis recently after the surgery, which is stupid. The day when Holt went missing, the tide was high, and some people even said it was the highest they had seen it. Despite this, Holt swam further into the water, which is stupid. Before Holt went into the water, he told the group that he was with that, "I know this beach like the back of my hand." However, after going into the water, he was never seen again. He was reported missing, and the country of Australia was shocked about their prime minister being missing. The search was massive. There were about 300 people looking for Holt, but eventually, on January 5th, 1968, the search was called off. The only thing left behind him on that beach was just a pile of his clothes. Most people think that he had just drowned, and his body will most likely never be found. To this day, this case remains unsolved. Previously, on the last video, we ended on the missing case of Harold Holt. Well, 2 years after his disappearance in the United States, a serial killer was running loose. The infamous identity of this serial killer is Charles Manson. However, before we talk about the horrific crimes of this serial killer, we need to go back to when he first started committing these horrible crimes. In 1967, after being released from prison, Charles Manson would move to San Francisco, California. As he stayed there, he would form a small group of loyal people called the Family. However, this group would grow to around 100 people. The group was essentially a religious cult, and Manson would teach about his religious beliefs. His beliefs were from science fiction and psychology. He would say that there would be a war about the human race, and he said that this would hurt the United States and leave him and his group in power. A few years before Manson moved to San Francisco, he would become really interested in the famous band known as the Beatles. In 1968, the Beatles would release their album called The White Album. Manson would be most interested in their song called Helter Skelter on the album. Manson would say that this song is about the Beatles predicting the human race war he was talking about. Manson would estimate that the war would happen in the summer of 1969. However, the war he talked about didn't happen. Eventually, Manson and his group would go on a killing spree. It is believed that Manson and his group killed 35 people. The group would go and kill celebrities in Hollywood. One of their first and more known victims was Sharon Tate. Sharon lived in a more isolated part of Beverly Hills, but there were still some neighbors. She was also pregnant at the time. On August 9th, 1969, Sharon was spending time with her friends at her home. Late into the night, neighbors reported to hear gunshots at Sharon's home. At 8 a.m. the next morning, the housekeeper discovered the bodies. Sharon was stabbed 16 times, and her unborn child didn't survive. Manson and his group would also be responsible for the murder of Lena LaBaca and Jay Sebring. Manson and his group would go on a murdering spree between August 8th to August 10th of 1969. In October of that year, Manson and his followers were caught on the suspicion of auto theft. They were charged with 9 murders, but like I said, it is believed to be way more. In 1971, Manson and 4 other of his members were sentenced to death. However, the trial was held in California, and in 1972, California abolished the death penalty, so their sentences were changed to life in prison the next year. Eventually, on November 19th, 2017, Charles Manson would die of natural causes at the age of 83. There's a lot to Charles Manson and his cult, and I could probably make an entire video on it, so let me know if you would all want to see that. Randy Stephen Kraft was born on March 19, 1945 in Long Beach, California to parents Harold and Opal Kraft. His father worked as a production operative, and his mother worked several jobs to help support the family. Randy had 3 older sisters who he was very close with, and he was also close with his mother. In school, Randy was known for being very intelligent. When he was a junior in high school, he was placed into accelerated learning classes, and he was a very pleasant person to be around. While growing up, Randy would date girls, but he would soon realize that he was more attracted to men and kept the secret. However, once he enrolled at Claremont College, he would get his first job working as a bartender at a gay bar. Randy would hook up with men at the bar multiple times. Once he got into college, his grades would also start to slip, and he would start drinking and doing drugs. His grades got so bad that he had to repeat classes, which would prevent him from graduating. In 1966, he was arrested after trying to hook up with an undercover cop at Hunting Beach. He wasn't charged from this, so his record remained clean. In 1967, he would eventually graduate with a degree in economics. Shortly after graduating in 1968, he would join the U.S. Air Force. He would do well in the Air Force by ranking up to Airman First Class, and he would also become a supervisor. However, he told high military officials about his sexuality, and he was given a medical discharge. After this, he would tell his family about his sexuality. His parents didn't support his lifestyle at first, but they would eventually accept it. After telling his family, though, he also became distant, just like his father. In 1970, Randy would commit his second crime. Randy would approach a 13-year-old boy named Joseph Francher. Joseph was a runaway, and Randy would tell him that he could stay at his apartment. Randy would also say that he could have sex with a woman he knew. Once Joseph came to Randy's apartment, he was given drugs, and he was sexually assaulted assaulted. Luckily, Joseph was able to escape after Randy left for work. He was taken to the hospital and police would come to question him. Joseph was embarrassed about the sexual assault and he didn't tell police about it. He also said that the drugs he was given, he agreed to take. Unfortunately, after an only small investigation, Randy was not charged. In 1971, Randy would start his murdering spree. Randy would commit his murders in Southern California. Specifically, he would commit murders in Orange County. Most of his victims were young men from ages 13 to 35, and they were mostly hitchhikers. Randy would offer alcohol in his car, and these victims would go with him. Once they got into the car, Randy would drug them with tranquilizers. After this, he would bind the victims so they can't move, and he would proceed to rape them. After he would kill them from either strangulation, bludgeoning, or asphyxiation, he would dump the bodies near freeways. This would give Randy the nickname the Freeway Killer. By 1975, Randy had 14 victims, and police had no leads on the serial killer. However, the friends of one of Randy's victims recognized Randy's black and white Mustang. Police would go to question Randy, and after questioning him, they thought he was the serial killer. However, the victim was believed to be killed by accident, and no charges were filed. But finally, on May 14th, 1983, Randy was arrested after driving under the influence. Police would investigate his car, and they discovered the body of one of his victims, Terry Lee Gambrell. This time, the police finally decided to not be stupid, and they actually launched an entire investigation of Randy. They found bloodstains and drugs in his car. Randy was charged with Terry's murder, and they would connect his other murders together. In September 1988, Randy's trial would start and last for 13 months. Randy was charged with 16 counts of murder, 1 count of sodomy, and 1 count of emasculation. Randy was given the death penalty. However, Randy is still on death row to this day. He's currently 78 years old, so he will most likely die of natural causes or something. Dennis Rader, also known as the BTK Killer, was born on March 9, 1945 in Pittsburgh, Kansas. However, he and his family moved to Wichita, Kansas, which is where he was raised. His father, William E. Rader, was in the U.S. Marine Corps during World War II, and after he would go to work at the Kansas Electric Utility. His mother, Dorothea M. Rader, worked as a bookkeeper at Leaker's IGA Market in Park City, Kansas. Dennis seemed normal from the outside. He joined the Boy Scouts, and he would also participate in group activities that his church would do. However, secretly, when Dennis was growing up, he would cut out females in magazines, and he would draw ropes and gags on the cutouts, so he wasn't the most normal when he was growing up. After he would finish drawing these pictures, he would glue them onto an index card like they were Pokemon cards, and he would carry them around. He would also get excited in a sexual way when he would read books about murder. He wanted to tie women to train tracks, and he would also tie cats to trees and hang them until they would die. A psychologist named Dr. Terrence G. Leary studied Rader and said that his behavior in his childhood was most likely caused by abuse. Leary believes that in reality his childhood wasn't so stable. Dennis would go to Riverview Elementary School and he would struggle with school. He was a below average student and was more described as being very introverted. He would eventually graduate in 1963 at Wichita Heights High School, and after he would get a job working at a small grocery store. In 1966, when he was 21, he would join the U.S. Air Force. Even while being in the Air Force, it wouldn't stop him from being weird because he'd peek through windows and watch women undress, and he would steal women's underwear. Soon after he returned from the Army, he would get married on May 22, 1971 to Paula Diaz. In July 1973, he would get a job at a small aircraft manufacturing company called Cessna, but soon after he would go to college at Wichita State University to get a bachelor's degree so he could become a police officer. However, in late 1973, he would get fired from Cessna. He became really unhappy because of getting fired, and it led him to thinking about the dark thoughts that he had had when he was a child. He would eventually start something called trolling. Now, it's not that type of trolling where you film a dead body in the forest, but he would drive around neighborhoods and school campuses and look at young women to lust over. He would stalk women in grocery stores, and he wanted to hide in the back of their car and kidnap them once they got in. By 1974, he was ready to go after his first victims. In the neighborhood that Dennis lived in, a new Latino family moved in called the Oteros. Joseph Otero, who was 38, and his wife Julie Otero, who was 33, had 5 children. Dennis became attracted to Julie and her 11-year-old daughter, Josephine, because they were Latino. He would stalk the family to get to know their routine, and on January 15, 1974, he would commit his first murders. He grabbed what he called his hit kit, which was knives, a gun, cords, tape, plastic bags, hoods, and gloves. At 7 to 7:30 a.m., he went into the family's backyard and cut their phone line. Dennis would enter the house when one of the children was likely letting the family dog out and the door was open. He was thinking that there was only Julie, Josephine, and their 9-year-old son Joey in the house, but he would discover that Joseph was also in the house. The couple's 3 older children were at school at the time. Dennis broke into the home. After realizing this, he would threaten the family with his gun and then tell them he needed money, food, and a car to flee the home. He would say that he wouldn't hurt them and he tied them up. However, soon after, Dennis would put a bag over Joseph's head and some cord, and he would strangle him to death. He would do the same thing to the rest of the family. While Dennis was putting a bag over Joey's head, Julie woke up, so Dennis would make his way back over to Julie and kill her by strangling her with a cord. Joey would eventually die from suffocation. Eventually Josephine woke up, and Dennis would take her to the basement, and he would hang her on a pipe, which is when she would pass away. Unfortunately, the person who discovered the bodies was one of their older siblings, Charlie, who was just 15 years old at the time. Once he got home from school, he would discover the bodies and try to call police, but the phone lines were cut. He would go get help from a neighbor, and they would call the police. Police would arrive and search the house, and they would find the disturbing scene. To make this even worse, it was reported that Dennis masturbated on some of his victims. Joseph's watch was missing and Julie's purse was dumped out, but besides that, there wasn't anything else that was stolen. Unfortunately, at the time, police were unable to find the killer. To make Dennis's crimes even worse, he would photograph his victims after he killed them. On April 4th, 1974, Dennis would kill Catherine Bray after she returned home with her brother Kevin, which Dennis was not expecting. Like he said to the Otero family, he needed money, food, and a car to escape town. He brought the two into the bedroom and forced Kevin to tie his sister's hands and feet. Dennis would try to tie up Kevin too, but Kevin fought back and was able to escape Dennis. Unfortunately, while the struggle was happening, Kevin wasn't able to get the gun, and Dennis got a hold of it and shot him in the head twice. Dennis would then go back to the other room to finish killing Catherine, but she would also fight back, but she was unfortunately overpowered by Dennis. Dennis realized that trying to strangle her wasn't going to work, so he stabbed her in the abdomen multiple times. While Dennis was with Catherine, Kevin was able to escape the house and get into his car to go get help. Unfortunately, by the time that paramedics got to the home, Catherine Bright was dead. Fortunately, Kevin was able to survive the attack and recover fully. It would be 3 years after this murder that Dennis would kill again. Dennis was driving through neighborhoods when he spotted Shirley Vian. Dennis was planning on going to kill another woman named Cheryl, but she was not home that day. Dennis would go down Hydraulic Street and saw a 5-year-old boy named Steve Rolford. Dennis pulled out a picture of his wife and son and asked if they knew who they were. Steve would say no, and he would return home. It turns out that Steve was the son of Shirley, and it was most likely to test if he would know who he was when he would return to their house. Later, Dennis would return to the house of his next victim, posing as a detective. Steve would answer the door and let him in, since to him he was a detective. There are 3 other people in the house at the time, which were Steve's 2 other siblings and his mom, Shirley Vian. He turned off the TV and shut the blinds. Shirley would come out into the living room and was immediately scared of the stranger in her home. Dennis would lock all 3 of the children in the bathroom. He told Shirley that he wanted to do stuff to her, but told her it wasn't going to be rape. He would calm her down with a glass of water and a cigarette. However, after this, he would strangle Shirley to death with a cord. Dennis would leave when the phone in the house started to ring, which led the 3 children screaming for their mom. After her death, her husband Richard Vian would raise the children. In December 1977, Dennis would obsessively stalk 25-year-old Nancy Fox. On December 8th, Dennis would cut the phone lines and wait for Nancy to get home. When she got home, Dennis would attack her. Just like his other victims, he tied her up and said he had a sexual issue and was going to rape her. After he finished, he would strangle her to death. The following day, he would make a call to police saying, "Yes, we'll find a homicide at 843 South Pershing. Nancy Fox." That's correct. Police would find Nancy's body, and they would replay the police call recording to try to find the identity of this person through their voice, but they couldn't find anything. He had 3 more victims, which were 53-year-old Maureen Hedge in 1985, 28-year-old Vicky Wedgler in September 1986, and his final victim, 62-year-old Dorless Davis. By the time he killed Davis, he thought he was getting too old to kill since he was in his mid-40s. Dennis would hide from the public eye until 2004. It was the 30-year anniversary of the Otero family murder, and the Wichita Eagle newspaper ran an article about it. Also, author Robert Beatty would release a book called Nightmare in Wichita: The Hunt for the BTK Strangler. Both the article and book made Dennis think they were trying to make profit from his murders. On March 17, 2004, Dennis would send a letter to the Wichita Eagle under the fake identity of Bill Thomas Kilman, which the initials read BTK, bind, torture, and kill. The letter contained pictures of Vicky Wedgler and her driver's license. The letter was also signed with the same signature that he had signed with previous letters. This letter sent Dennis back into the public eye. Dennis would send the letter, and in the letter would be a word puzzle like he was the Riddler from Batman. On June 9, 2004, he left a package taped to a stop sign. It included a gruesome description of the Otero murders and a sketch of a body hanging called "The Sexual Thrill Is My Bill." On June 17, 2004, another package was found in the Wichita, Kansas Public Library, which he would say that he was about to pass away and he wanted to kill again. On October 22, 2004, another package was found containing a drawing of children with bindings across their bodies and faces. He would also try to mislead police with false information about BTK. He would say that he was born in Wichita, but in reality he wasn't. Dennis would eventually get the position as the president of his church. 8 days after getting this position, he would say that there was a box with a bomb in the back of a pickup truck. Inside the box there was information about the killings he had done, and there was also a question from Dennis about a floppy disk. Dennis would ask if a floppy disk could be traced, and police would say that it couldn't be traced, which they lied about. On January 25th, 2005, a box was found at the Cake TV studio, which contained a doll with a noose around its neck, dead to a pipe, which is the recreation of Josephine Otero's murder. On February 3rd, 2005, Dennis would send a letter to Cake TV saying that he was going to send a floppy disk. On February 16th, 2005, a floppy disk was found and it was traced back to a computer that was used at the church under the name Dennis. They found out that the church's president, Dennis Rader, sent the disk. They would ask Dennis's daughter for a DNA sample to match the semen found at the crime scene. The DNA was a match to the semen, and after 30 years, Dennis Rader was identified as the BTK killer. On February 25th, 2005, police surrounded Dennis's car and he was arrested. Dennis wouldn't talk at first, but eventually he would give a 30-hour confession. Police would find evidence connecting him to his other murders. Dennis was sentenced to life in prison under 10 counts of first-degree murder, and is up for parole in 2180, which, if he somehow lives to 235, I think he might be dying in prison. Dennis is currently in prison at the El Dorado Correctional Facility in El Dorado, Kansas. Gary Ray Bowles, also known as the I-95 Killer, would be convicted of killing 6 gay men from March to October of 1994. Gary would travel to different states by the southern and eastern seaboard. He would go and pretend to be interested in these men and stay at their house for a week. Once he gained these men's trust, he would kill them. After he would kill them, he would stuff toilet paper, rags, dirt, leaves, and sometimes adult toys in his victims' mouths. After killing his victims, he would take their credit card and their car to go kill his next victim. Gary would go on a killing spree, and after killing 6 gay men, he got caught. He would be caught after he killed his last victim, which was 47-year-old Walter Jamel Hinton in Jacksonville Beach. Gary would say that he killed 7 people, but the police wouldn't investigate his 7th victim. Gary was given the death penalty, and he was given lethal ejection on August 22nd, 2019 at Florida State Prison. His last words would be a handwritten apology to the Hilton family by saying he was so very sorry to all of the family and friends of Mr. Hinton, and he would also say, "I never wanted to kill him, and I'm sorry for all the pain and suffering I've caused." Anthony Edward Sowell was born on August 19, 1959 in Cleveland, Ohio. Anthony was subjected to abuse when he was a child. At just 11 years old, he began to rape his 11-year-old niece. When he was 18 years old, he would enlist into the U.S. Marine Corps, and he would serve for 7 years before being discharged in 1985. Once he returned home, he would start committing crimes, like giving a minor drugs and alcohol, and his crimes would become even worse when he was charged with domestic violence. However, in 1989, Anthony would rape a 21-year-old woman. Luckily, she was able to survive the incident, and Anthony was given 15 years in prison. However, after he got out in 2005, he would begin his killings. His first victim was 38-year-old Crystal Dozier, and she had 7 children. She had been struggling with drug addiction after she lost one of her children. Anthony would lure Crystal with the promise of giving her drugs at his home, but once Crystal got to his home, Anthony raped and killed her. He would go on a killing spree for 2 years, and he would target women that he thought their loved ones wouldn't report them missing. Anthony would be correct because some of his victims weren't even known to be missing until their remains were found. However, Crystal was one of the victims that was reported missing. Police would say that since Crystal was using drugs, they figured that she would be back in a few days. Unfortunately, the police didn't care to look into this at all, which could have saved many victims. It wouldn't be until 2009 that Anthony's killings would end. In September of that year, Anthony was planning on targeting a woman who wanted to get drugs from him. However, similar to all of his other killings, he beat her, raped, and choked her with an electrical cord until she passed out. Luckily, she wasn't dead, and Anthony let her leave. Anthony would threaten her if she went to police about him. She would listen and not go to police right away. So a month later, on October 20th, Anthony promised another woman alcohol and drugs. Once she arrived, she realized she forgot her ID, but Anthony would lunge and attack her. Luckily, she was able to escape by climbing out a 3rd-story window. She was naked, and Anthony's neighbors saw and called the police. However, once police arrived, she refused to speak to them, and Anthony had fled the scene. It turns out, though, that woman eventually went to police and filed a report. Her attack and the other woman's report allowed police to get a search warrant for Anthony's home. Police would find 2 decomposing bodies and a shallow grave in Anthony's basement. They would find 8 more bodies in total, and a woman's skull wrapped in a paper bag. It was revealed that Anthony had 11 victims in total. Luckily, on Halloween 2009, Anthony would be found and arrested. It turns out that Anthony had spent $20,000 to get new plumbing, grease traps, and sewer lines to hide the smell of the bodies. Anthony's trial was very publicized, and eventually Anthony would be charged on 81 charges, including kidnapping, rape, tampering with evidence, abuse of a corpse, and 11 counts of murder. He was given the death penalty, but would die in February 2021 from natural causes. Anthony's house was demolished, and in replacement, a memorial site called the Garden of 11 Angels is there to remember his victims. Richard Beasley was a serial killer who looked for his victims on the website known as Craigslist. Richard would offer men looking for work $300 a week and housing in a 2-bedroom trailer. His offer would read, "Wanted, caretaker for farm. Simply watch over 688-acre patch of hilly farmland and feed a few cows." More than 100 men responded in desperate need of work. One of these men was 48-year-old Scott Davis. Richard would agree to meet up on November 6, 2011. Richard would also have an accomplice who was 16-year-old Brogan Rafferty. When they met up, Richard gave a fake name, which is Jack, and his accomplice's fake name was Rafferty, and he said that that was his nephew. After they met up at the restaurant, they would leave to go to a wooded area, which is where the farm was. Once they got out, Scott was standing, and he heard what sounded like a gun misfiring. Scott was unfortunately shot in the elbow, but he started running. While he ran, his baseball cap that he had on fell off. He eventually made it to a home, which is where he called police. He would lead police to find his hat, so they could use it as evidence. When they arrived at the location, they found an empty grave, which was meant for Scott. As they investigated, it turned out there was 2 other bodies, which were Ralph Ginger, and the identity of the other body was unknown until 5 days after their investigation started. They got a call from a woman named Deborah Bruce, who said that her brother, David Pauly, had replied to an ad similar to the one that Richard put up. She was able to confirm it was David because of the ID bracelet he was wearing when he died. Police would investigate the Craigslist ad posted and trace them to a home in Akron, Ohio, which is where Richard rented the floor of the home using Ralph's identity. Luckily, Richard and his accomplice were arrested on November 16, 2011. During their trial, they were also found being connected to the murder of Timothy Kern. Richard's accomplice was given life in prison on 3 counts of murder, and Richard was given the death penalty. However, Richard's trial was done again in 2020 after a procedural error was found in the 2013 trial, but he was still given the death penalty. Richard is still on death row at the Chillicothe Correctional Institution in Ohio. Anneliese Michel was born September 21, 1952 in Klingenberg, Germany, to parents Joseph and Anna Michel. Anneliese was raised in a devoted Catholic home. She was described as being a very bright girl, and there wasn't anything wrong with her until 1969 when she had her first seizure. She was at school, but all of a sudden she started spazzing out and was in a trance-like state. Luckily, the seizure would stop and she would go back to normal. Nothing would happen until 1970, which was a year after her first seizure. This time she would have a seizure in the middle of the night. Parents would find her in a trance-like state, and they also saw she had wet the bed. When the seizure stopped, Anneliese said that she had no idea what happened. After the seizure happened, the family would take Anneliese to a neurologist who is Dr. Luthi. A neurologist is someone who is specialized in diagnosing disorders of the brain and nervous system. Luthi would come to the conclusion that Anneliese was suffering from TLE, temporal lobe epilepsy. TLE is a common form of epilepsy that affects 50 million people worldwide. One of the side effects of TLE is forgetting that you had a seizure, which is the side effect that Anneliese had. Luthi gave Anneliese medication to help with the seizures. However, after this, the seizures kept on happening and they got worse. In the spring of 1973, Anneliese said that she had heard knocking in her bedroom and voices telling her that she was going to hell. Her condition got so bad that Anneliese and her family decided that they would have to put her in a psychiatric hospital because they couldn't help her anymore. However, the psychiatric hospital would try different medicine, but nothing worked. Her condition kept getting worse, and she started having visual hallucinations. Essentially, if she looked at someone's face, their face would turn into a demon. So to combat this, she would just start looking down to avoid having to see people's faces. Eventually, Anneliese would start claiming that she was possessed by 6 demons. After a while, her family decided that they would need to turn to their religion to see if they can find anyone to help Anneliese. Anneliese would leave the hospital, and her family went to their Catholic church to see if they could help Anneliese. However, the family was turned away because the church said that they couldn't do anything about it. At this point, the family had no idea what to do, and her condition was getting even worse. She started adapting these strange behaviors. One thing she would do was go under the table for 2 entire days and bark like a dog. Another thing she would do is eat coal out of the fireplace. She would also become very strong. One example of this was that when she was squeezing an apple, the apple eventually exploded. Eventually, the family found a priest who offered to help the family, whose name was Ernest Halt. Alt would talk to the bishop of the Catholic Church to let a priest help perform an exorcism. The bishop would grant an exorcism, and they found a local priest named Arnold Renz to help with the exorcism. Finally, on September 24th, 1975, the first exorcism was performed on Anneliese Michel. It turns out that Renz allowed clips from this exorcism to be recorded, and in total 42 recordings were made. If you don't want to listen to this audio because it is disturbing, skip to this timestamp.
So Rosenkrantz-Monat, weißt du ja, ne?
Ja.
Aber die wenigste beten. Ja. Und in der Kirche wird am allerwenigste gebeten, weil die Herrn Pfarrer ja das für Unordnung halten. Ja. Alle? Fast.
So if you listen to the audio, I don't think she sounds normal. For the next 10 months, there was a total of 67 exorcisms conducted. During these exorcisms, Anneliese revealed the 6 demons that were possessing her. They were Cain, Judas, Lucifer, Nero, Fleischmann, and Adolf Hitler. After they were conducted, she became normal again. However, she would eventually go back to her old behavior. In the spring of 1976, she was even worse. She was biting herself and banging her head against the wall. She also became violent with her family and also with herself. She would also drop to her knees, which led to her breaking both of her kneecaps so that she could pray. At this time, she also stopped eating, and it was reported that she weighed only under 80 pounds. On June 30th, 1976, she had her last exorcism, and the following morning she was found deceased. Her cause of death was reported to be dehydration and malnutrition. At this time, this was a massive story in Germany, and people began blaming the parents for Anneliese's death, and they were eventually charged with negligent homicide. However, this charge wouldn't lead them to prison because the court said that they had suffered enough. The priests were given 6 months in jail for negligent manslaughter. However, they wouldn't serve any jail time because the sentence was eventually discarded. To this day, there's still not a clear answer about how Anneliese came to the state that she was in. Some people think it was the medicine she was given, but on the other hand, people think it was the exorcisms. 29 years after her death, on September 9th, 2005, a movie based on her story was released called The Exorcism of Emily Rose. The audience score was 60% on Rotten Tomatoes, so take that for what you will.
A massive car bomb exploded outside of a large federal building in downtown Oklahoma City, shattering that building.
On April 23, 1968, Timothy McVeigh was born in Pendleton, New York. He grew up in a blue-collar family and was the middle child of 2 sisters. However, while he was growing up, his parents went through a divorce. His parents told him and his 2 sisters that they could pick who they wanted to live with. Timothy was upset at his mother for the divorce and thought she was the one who caused it, so he decided to live with his father. He would use his computer skills to learn how to hack, and he was able to break into a defense department's computer system. He was in the graduating class of 1986, and after graduating, he proceeded to go into a local business college. His gun obsession grew even further. His obsession grew to the point that he believed that one day the United States government would revoke the Second Amendment of the Declaration of Independence, which allows the U.S. citizen to keep and bear firearms. While his gun obsession was growing, he also delved into another hobby, which is reading books about survivalism. One of the books that I read was called The Turner Diaries, which is a racist, neo-Nazi book about the bombing on a building in Washington, D.C. In 1988, Timothy made the decision to join the military. While he was serving, he earned a reward which is a Bronze Star for his bravery in the Persian Gulf War. After 3 years of serving in 1991, Timothy would leave the military and go back to his home state, New York. Once he returned, he tried to look for a job. However, he was unable to find any work. He would be able to find work eventually with a group of old friends who were Terry Nichols and Michael Fortier, who he knew from the military. The group would go around to different fairs in the United States and sell guns. In March 1993, Timothy drove to witness an ongoing FBI siege of the Branch Davidian compound in Waco, Texas. Timothy thought the government should make the siege that the FBI were doing illegal. This would lead Timothy and his 2 friends to contacting members of the militia groups who were around in the Midwest. In September 1994, after being inspired by the members of the militia groups, Timothy would plan to bomb a building in Oklahoma City called the Alfred P. Mora Federal Building. Timothy told Terry about his plan and he was on board with it. During the course of 6 months, the 2 planned the bombing. They got several amounts of ammonium nitrate fertilizer, which can help fuel a bomb to explode. Finally, on April 19, 1995, their plan was put into action. That morning, Timothy drove a rented truck containing a bomb into the front parking lot of the building, proceeded to abandon the truck, and make his way to a getaway car. At 9:02 a.m., the bomb went off, and immediately the calm, peaceful morning turned into a fiery scene with rubble collapsing from the building. However, even worse was that 168 people lost their lives that day, and 19 of those victims were children. It was reported that around 850 people were also injured from the attack. The FBI arrived at the upsetting scene and started their investigation. A day after the bombing, the rear axle of the rented truck was found, which contained the vehicle identification number, which was traced back to a body shop in Junction City, Kansas. The employees there were interviewed, and together they helped the FBI to sketch a pretty similar depiction of Timothy, which besides that haircut, I think they did a pretty good job. The FBI went around the town and went to see if any businesses had seen him, and the hotel said that someone who looked like that stayed at a hotel. The hotel said the name of this person was Tim McVeigh. After receiving this name on April 21st, the FBI made a call to Berea's Criminal Justice Information Services Division, and they gave them the potential suspect's name. They looked up the name, and it turned out that Timothy was already in jail. He was pulled over 80 miles north of Oklahoma City by a state trooper because he had noticed that the car had a missing license plate. The trooper eventually discovered that Timothy also had a concealed weapon. It turns out that he was arrested only an hour and a half after the bombing, and only 2 days after the bombing, Timothy was taken into federal custody. An investigation was launched on Timothy, and it led the FBI to connect a bunch of evidence connecting him to the bombing. There were chemicals from the bombing on his clothing, and a business card was also found with handwriting that said TNT at $5 stick, need more, which probably meant that he needed more materials to build the bomb. They would also eventually discover that Terry helped build the bomb, and apparently Michael found out about this, but he decided not to tell anybody. The FBI wanted to make sure they had the right people, so there's an entire list of all the evidence they collected, but here it is. They gathered more than 3 tons of evidence, did 28,000 interviews, followed more than 43,000 leads, they searched over 13.2 million hotel registration records, they looked over 3.1 million truck rental records, and they looked at more than 682,000 airline reservation records. At the time of the bombing, Terry was at his home in Harrington, Kansas. 2 days after the bombing, Terry went to the Harrington police station in Kansas. He said he was watching the news, and he saw that he was a material witness. Now, a material witness is someone who bears information on a case. Terry's brother James was also identified as a material witness, however the charges against him were soon dropped. And 2 hours into his questioning, a warrant was sent out for his arrest. However, 7 more hours of questioning was conducted on Terry before he was arrested for connections with the bombing. In August 1995, Timothy and Terry were charged with the bombing. The court would seek the death penalty for both of them. Timothy's trial would begin in April 1997. During the trial, Michael would testify against him because of a plea bargain. Eventually, the jury would give Timothy the verdict, which was the death penalty. He was scheduled to be sentenced to death on June 13th, 1997. Later that same year, Terry was found guilty of 8 counts of involuntary manslaughter and conspiracy, and he was given life in prison. Timothy's sentencing would be delayed for almost 4 years until finally on June 11th, 2001, Timothy was given the death penalty by lethal injection. Luckily, the building where the tragic bombing happened was rebuilt and turned into a museum, and right behind the building lies a memorial right by a pond to honor the 168 lives that were lost on April 19th, 1995. Mark Twitchell was born on July 4th, 1979 in Edmonton, Canada. While he was growing up, he developed a passion for filmmaking. He would attend the Northern Alberta Institute of Technology and graduate in 2000 with a bachelor's degree in radio and television arts. Mark was a fan of Star Wars, which led to him to make one of his first projects, which is a fan-made Star Wars film called The Secrets of the Rebellion. Mark would give a short summary of the film by saying this: "The alternate story tracks show what happened to the last Jedi left in the galaxy apart from Ben and Yoda, how the Death Star plans were stolen, and what the Empire had to go through in order to track them down. I feel we've really blended elements of the EU into this seamlessly while taking some creative licenses in order to liven things up and adapt them better for the movie medium." Mark was also a fan of the TV show called Dexter, which is about a serial killer committing murders and trying to avoid getting caught. He loved this show this much that he decided that he wanted to make his next major movie project about a serial killer. However, he didn't want to make the movies like how movies are normally made. Instead, he wanted to become the serial killer and write his experiences about killing into a film. And this movie was called SK Confessions, which stood for Serial Killer Confessions. Mark would set up his killings by using his garage as his kill room, which was inspired by Dexter. He would then go onto Plenty of Fish, which is a dating website, and set up an online profile under the name Sheena, in which he would set the profile picture as a woman with blonde hair. On October 3rd, 2008, a man by the name of Giles Teteralt, who had recently gotten a divorce from his wife, was on Plenty of Fish. He stumbled upon the profile by the name of Sheena. Giles would message the profile, and him and Sheena would start talking. Eventually, Sheena would say that she and Giles should meet up at her house that night. Giles would agree and ask for her address so he could pick her up. Sheena would say that she wasn't comfortable sending her address on the website, so instead she would send the directions to her home using different roads and landmarks to describe where she lived. She would say that her garage door would be open and she wanted Giles to enter through there. Giles thought it was a little bit weird that she sent her address in that format, but he was still open to meeting up, and that night he would do so. He would eventually be able to find the house, and the garage door was just open enough for someone to crawl through. Once he entered the garage, it was dark, but he could see that the walls were covered in saran wrap. While he was standing there, though, he would be attacked by someone wearing a gold hockey mask, and this person was Mark. Mark would stun Giles with a stun baton, which sent him falling to the floor. He looked up at his attacker and realized that he was holding a gun. Despite this, though, Giles decided to fight back and he grabbed the gun. When Giles grabbed the gun, though, he realized it was made out of plastic, which means Mark was using a fake gun. Once he realized this, he fought back even more, and he was able to escape the grasps of his attacker. After this, he rolled out of the garage, since it was open enough for someone to crawl through. However, this entire time he was trying to escape his attacker, he was filled with adrenaline, which means he couldn't feel the effects of the stun baton. But once he got out of the garage, he fell to the ground, and the attacker tried to grab his leg and pull him back into the garage. Luckily, though, once again, he was able to escape the attacker. Once he escaped, he started running down an alleyway, which brought him to a walking trail, which is where he fell to the ground again. However, he saw his attacker off in the distance running towards him. Luckily, though, a couple was walking on the trail and saw Giles on the ground. Once they saw him, they came over to help him, and the attacker, by this point, had made it to where Giles was on the ground, and he acted like he was friends with Giles. However, soon after, Mark, the attacker, would walk back to the garage. Giles would look up at the couple so that they could help him, but this freaked them out, and they turned and walked away. Luckily, after this, Giles was able to make it back to his vehicle, and he drove away. Once he got home, he felt embarrassed that this happened to him, and he decided that he wouldn't report it to the police. However, this incident wouldn't stop Mark from trying to kill. On October 10th, a 38-year-old man named Johnny Altinger was browsing through Plenty of Fish, and he stumbled across a profile by the name of Jen. He would message her, and they would start talking, and they agreed to meet up that night. However, Jen would say that she didn't want to send her address on the website, and she sent a set of directions using landmarks that would be able to bring Johnny to her house. She told him that once he got to her house, to go through the garage and then go up the back stairs to her house, and she would meet him there. Johnny thought it was weird that she sent him the directions like that, but he ignored it. However, before he left, he forwarded an email that was the directions that Jen sent him to one of his friends, and was joking about going missing. Johnny would be able to find the house, and it turns out that he was early, but he would see someone in the garage. Johnny would walk up to this person, and little did he know, he would be staring at the person that would later kill him. Mark would lie about his name and say that his name was Harry, and that he was renting the garage out from Jen, and he said that Jen was running late, and she would be there soon, and he told Johnny to come back in 15 to 20 minutes. Johnny would leave for 20 minutes, and when he came back, he entered through the garage. However, once he entered the garage, Mark would swing at Johnny with a metal pipe and struck him in the back of the head. Mark would proceed to beat Johnny with this pipe, and once he finished with the pipe, he stabbed Johnny to death. A few days after Johnny's disappearance, his friends would become suspicious and report Johnny missing to the police and give them the directions sent by Mark. The police would follow the directions all the way to Mark's house, and they would find the garage with all the plastic wrap on the wall. Their investigation would continue on Mark, and they found the SK confession script, and they realized that some of the information in the script hadn't been released to the public. Mark would be interrogated on October 20th, and he would admit to killing Johnny, but he said that Johnny became furious and he realized that the date was set up and attacked him instead. However, this is obvious bullshit, and the police would be able to get enough evidence, and he was arrested on October 31st, 2008. Finally, in April 2011, he was found guilty and was sentenced to a minimum sentence of 25 years in prison without parole. He is currently being held at the Saskatchewan Penitentiary.
How much he's affecting me.
Green grow the lilacs all sparkling with dew.
Thomas Neil Crean was born on May 27, 1850 in Glasgow, Scotland. 4 years after he was born, though, him, his parents, and his 8 other siblings would leave Scotland and immigrate over to Canada. This is where Thomas would get his education, including him enrolling into McGill College in Montreal. He would attend the college for a medical degree, and he would graduate on March 31, 1876. Soon after his graduation, he would meet Florza Elizabeth Brooks, and the two were intimate, which led to her having an unwanted pregnancy. This would lead Thomas to do his own abortion on Flora, which almost led to her death. Flora's father would soon hear about this, and he was furious at Thomas. So instead of protecting his daughter from the Scoofy Goober, he said that they should get married. Flora's father's wish would be granted, because on September 11th, 1876, they got married. Soon after the marriage, Thomas would travel to England to register as a graduate student at St. Thomas's Hospital. A few years later, Thomas would return to Canada, and he would become an abortionist. He had a good reputation as an abortionist until the body of a young woman named Kate Gardner was found in his office. An investigation was launched, and it was quite obvious with all the evidence they gathered that Thomas was the killer. However, for some reason, Thomas was not charged with the crime despite the evidence that was gathered against him. Because of this crime, Thomas would move to Chicago, Illinois, and start doing his abortions there. In August 1880, a woman by the name of Julia Faulkner would visit Thomas to get an abortion. However, Julia would mysteriously die under unknown circumstances. Thomas would be connected to the murder, however he would get off of the charges again. Thomas would also begin a side business, which was making an elixir to combat epilepsy. He would gain customers for this business, and one of them would be Daniel and Julia Scott, who were in a relationship. However, Thomas and Julia would begin having an affair. Eventually, though, Daniel would become suspicious that the two were having an affair, and once Thomas found this out, he began to add strychnine, which is a poison, to the medication. Unfortunately, this poison would eventually kill Daniel on June 14th, 1881. This time, however, Thomas would be found guilty of the murder and was given a life sentence. This would change though because he would be released on good behavior on July 31st, 1891. After his release, he would go back to London, and in there he would commit 2 murders. He would go after 2 prostitutes named Matilda Clover and Ellen Donworth, which he would kill by poisoning the 2. He would go on to poisoning 2 more women named Emma Shreville and Alice Marsh, and after the murders he accused his neighbor of the murders. He also said he had evidence against a man by the name of Joseph Harper, and he said if he paid him £1,500 or more, he would not go to the police. However, Joseph refused to pay, and obviously Thomas didn't have any evidence against him, and he eventually gave up. So instead of trying to get money from the case, Thomas decided to start bragging about how much he knows about the case. And to get his point across, he guided tours of the place that the murders took place to 2 people. One of these people he gave a tour to was Police Sergeant McIntyre. This guided tour caused McIntyre to start monitoring Thomas, and eventually he was arrested for 4 murders and an attempt of a 5th murder. His trial would last 5 days, and by the end of it, they decided that he would get the death penalty. He was sentenced to be hanged on November 15th, 1892, and that sentence would be carried out at Newsgate Prison in London. It's 1865 and Charles Kennedy, his wife Rosa, and the couple's 3-year-old son moved to Moreno Valley in New Mexico. Moreno Valley is surrounded by trees and mountains and brought a lot of travelers to check out the area. To take advantage of the amount of travelers, the couple would construct a guest house for the travelers to stay in after they checked out the area. Once it was open, the couple would start getting many customers staying at their guest home. However, these guests would end up never leaving that guest house because Charles would start killing the guests. After he killed them, he would take all their valuables and then burn or bury the bodies. One day a traveler came to stay at the guest home, and the traveler asked if there were many Indians in these parts. The reason he asked this was because Rosa was Indian. Charles's son, who was 9 years old, said, "Can't you smell the one Papa put under the floor?" This led to Charles killing the traveler, and then he picked up a firework poker and began beating his son with it until he passed out. He would do the same thing to Rosa and then lock her in the house. After this, Charles would leave and begin drinking outside until he passed out. Luckily, Rosa was able to escape and make it to the nearby town called Elizabethtown. She made it to the saloon in town, and in the saloon, 2 men named Clay Allison and Davy Crockett were drinking. Rosa would proceed to tell them about what happened that night, and also tell them that her husband was a serial killer. The 2 would go with Rosa back to the cabin, and once they got back, luckily Charles was still passed out, and they carried him back to Elizabethtown to the police. Charles would admit to the police that he killed 21 men. However, it was soon revealed that a judge who was known to be open to bribes would be working on the case. Since the town knew that Charles would easily be able to bribe the judge, they would lead a massive mob to the jail that Charles was staying at, and they broke him out of the jail at gunpoint. After this, Clay, who was part of the mob, would drag Charles behind his horse, and they tied a noose around his neck, and they proceeded to tie it to the horse. Clay would begin to ride his horse along the main street of the town until Charles' head was no longer attached to his body. Clay would then bring the head to the saloon, and he put the head on a stake to show the town what happened to murderers. From what I found, Clay was not charged with murdering Charles. Clay would pass away from a wagon accident on July 3rd, 1887. It is unknown what happened to Rosa and Charles's 9-year-old son. Jesse James was born on September 5th, 1847, which is also my birthday, so that's Pretty cool. He was born in Clay County, Missouri, which many years ago his parents Robert and Zerelda, also known as Z, decided to move to. The couple had 4 children, but unfortunately one of them passed away when they were only an infant. Robert would become a pastor at a small Baptist church, and Z stayed at home and would take care of the family's farm. However, in early 1850, during the Gold Rush era, Robert would be asked to travel in a wagon with a bunch of local men and work as a chaplain. Months later, though, it turns out that Robert drank contaminated water, which led to him having a fever. Now, back then, a fever was almost guaranteed to kill you, and unfortunately for Robert, that would be the case. He would be buried in an unmarked grave, and years later Jesse would try to find the grave, but he didn't have any luck. Z would eventually marry a man named Archie Rubin, who worked as a physician. Archie took a place as the father figure, and he taught Jesse and his brother how to ride a horse and how to shoot guns. Jesse was a very generous, bright kid when he was younger, and he liked to prank other people. In 1861, when Jesse was 13 years old, the Civil War began. And only 3 weeks after the war began, his older brother Frank would go in to fight on the Confederate side because the family owned slaves. When Jesse was only 16 years old, he would go into the war on the same side as his brother. Jesse and the Confederate army he joined committed many atrocities, such as the Centralia Massacre. The massacre would kill 122 Union soldiers. He would also be involved in the Lawrence Massacre, which killed around 150 soldiers. In 1865, Jesse would ride into Lexington, Missouri while holding a white flag. A white flag meant in the Civil War the soldier wanted a truce. Jesse would try this, but I think he did something wrong because he got shot in the chest. Somehow, though, he would survive the incident, and afterwards he would go to Nebraska to recover. He would return to Missouri after making a full recovery. Once the war ended, the brothers made a gang called the James Gang, which was a gang of criminals, essentially. Jesse's reason for starting this group is because he hated the industrial North. The gang would start committing crimes like robbing stores in 1866, and it's carried on for another 15 years. During those 15 years, the gang would kill and injure many innocent people. On December 7th, 1869, Jesse would kill a bank teller who was believed to kill Bill Anderson, who was a significant leader during the Civil War. Eventually, Frank would leave the group and he would begin living a peaceful life. However, Jesse continued his robberies and killings. On September 7th, 1881, Jesse would move his family and his wife Z, who was also his cousin, to St. Joseph, Missouri. Z had been trying to get Jesse to start living a quiet, peaceful life just like his brother. Jesse would finally agree, but he wanted to do one more bank robbery. On April 3rd, 1882, Jesse was planning his robbery with Bob and Charles Ford at his home. While planning though, Jesse noticed that a painting was crooked on his wall and he decided to grab a chair to stand on to fix it. As he was standing there though, a gunshot would ring out through the house. The two boys looked at the ground at Jesse and saw that their plan had worked. Jesse was 34 years old when he was assassinated. The reason the two brothers did this was to get a $10,000 reward promised by a governor named Tom Crittenden. The brothers would be arrested for the murder, but Tom would pardon them, which means they were cleared from the murder. Frank would say to Charles that he would one day kill him for killing his brother. The stress of fearing his death would cause Charles to take his own in 1884. In 1892, Bob would be in a bar, and while he was there, he was killed. Frank would pass away from natural causes on February 18th, 1915. Boone Helm was born January 28, 1828 in Kentucky, but in his early life, him and his family would move to Missouri. Helm was not the best behaved kid when he was younger. What I mean by not behaving is that it is reported that one time Helm walked his horse into the town's court and just started lecturing the judge while it was in session. If the sheriff would try to arrest him for being psychotic, he would resist the arrest. This type of aggressive behavior would continue on into his adulthood. Boone would eventually marry Lucinda Frances Browning in his early 20s. When Boone would drink though, which was often, he would get into a drunken rage and he would beat Lucinda. This would lead to her getting a divorce from him, and Boone's father Joseph would end up paying for the divorce. It is reported though that the divorce was extremely expensive, which led to Joseph going bankrupt. One day Boone's cousin Little Burry Shute, and I'm not joking, that was his actual name, he suggested to Boone that they should go out west to take advantage of the gold rush going on at that time. However, Shute would try to back out and decide he didn't want to go. This decision made Boone furious and he decided he was going to kill him. Unfortunately, Boone would go through with his plan to murder Shute and he would stab him. After this, Boone would start traveling towards the west, but on the way there, Shute's brother would find him, capture him, and then turn him into the authorities. After being turned in, Boone would be sent to an asylum for people who were mentally deranged. While staying there, Boone would manipulate a security guard into thinking he could trust him, and the guard would let Boone escape the asylum. After escaping, Boone would continue his path out west. On his way to California, it is believed that Boone would fight men with weapons, and this would actually lead to these men's death. It is unknown how many people Boone killed on his way to California, but at this point it is clear that he had a desire to kill. However, miners would find out about these killings and they wanted to kill Boone, so this would cause him to flee the west. Boone would head out east, and on his way there he would get companions. Now Boone and his group decided that they were going to head from Salt Lake City all the way to Fort Hall, Idaho, which is about 178.8 miles away. However, on their way there, they would be hit with harsh winter conditions. Despite this though, they would continue on until they made it to Bannack River. There they would be attacked by Native Americans, and they would chase them until the men were lost and didn't know where they were at. At this point, their horses were exhausted, and this would lead to them killing their horses. At this point, everyone in the group gave up except for Boone and a man named Burton. The two would find an abandoned cabin, and Burton would go in to rest. Boone, however, would try to go find somewhere else to get food, but he would eventually give up and then go back to the cabin. Once he got back, though, it turns out that Burton had committed suicide. After seeing this, Boone would proceed to eat the leg off of the body. After he ate the leg, he continued on until he found an Indian camp. A man by the name of John Powell found Boone and took him in. He gave him food and clothes and sent him to some reservations out in Salt Lake City. So basically, he was back where he started. While in Salt Lake City, though, he killed 2 more men. But after this, people wanted to harm him for killing these 2 men, so he decided he would try to go back out to California. Once he arrived in California, he would befriend a man who owned a ranch. This man took him into his home to take care of him. However, Boone would gain his trust, and he would eventually kill the rancher. After this, he would travel to Oregon, and he would do the same thing, where he robbed and killed multiple men. However, while in Oregon, he was caught for killing a man, but his brother, Old Tex, paid off the witnesses, which caused him to be released from prison. Boone would go to Texas and end up killing more men. Finally, though, Boone would be in Montana where he was arrested, and he wouldn't be released this time. Boone had the smartest idea and said that he hadn't killed anyone, even though at this point he's probably killed hundreds of people. This claim didn't work, and Boone was sentenced to death. Boone would be hanged on January 14th, 1864. It is still unknown how many people Boone had killed.
Warning: this is not a test. It has been reported that 2 or more individuals have been committing homicides and robberies in Dayton, Ohio. Unfortunately, at this moment we don't have any information about any of the suspects' physical appearance. More updates will be released in the next few hours. Thank you.
Ordinary Christmas season in Dayton, Ohio. The city is surrounded by Christmas lights. The almost 200,000 civilians are doing their ordinary traditions, like watching their favorite Christmas movies or spending time with family. However, a group of teenagers were bored that Christmas with nothing to do. They all weren't close to their families, and all they had was each other. They called themselves the Downtown Posse, and they were led by 19-year-old Marvelous Keene. 3 other people made up this group, which was Keene's 16-year-old girlfriend, Laura Taylor, 17-year-old DeMarcus Smith, and his girlfriend, 20-year-old Heather Matthews. As they sat deciding what to do, they made the normal person decision like anybody would think and decided that they wanted to go on a killing spree. They came to the decision that their killing spree would begin on Christmas Eve, and they would first target 34-year-old Joseph Wilkerson, who was a General Motors worker. Their plan was to send Laura and Heather to his home to seduce him into having sex with them. However, their real intention was to rob and unfortunately kill him. So their plan would begin, which would eventually turn into a horrific killing spree. Keene, Taylor, and Matthews would walk to his house, and Joseph was willing to have sex with the 2 women. The 4 of them would go into his house, where inside they would drink, and after a while of being there, Taylor would take Joseph to the bedroom, and Keene and Matthews would begin to follow after them. Once in the bedroom, Keene would take out his gun and order Joseph to get on the bed. Joseph would comply, and once he was on the bed, Taylor and Matthews would tie him to the bed. After this, Taylor, Matthews, and Joseph would walk around the house with the goal of finding valuable items to steal. In total, they found 5 items, which were a TV, a blow dryer, a microwave oven, a curling iron, and a cordless phone. After taking these items, the group would stuff all the items into Joseph's car, which they also planned on taking. After this, Keene would find a .32 caliber Derringer in the garage, and he would take the gun. The group would take Joseph back to his bedroom, and there Keene would cover Joseph with blankets and shoot him in the stomach. According to Keene, the reason he covered Joseph with blankets was so that the noise was muffled. However, after this, Joseph's feet were shaking, which meant he was still alive, and he was feeling all the pain from the wound. However, after this, Taylor would grab a gun and shoot Joseph in the head, which after the second shot, he stopped moving. Right after, they would flee the area in Joseph's car. That same night, Keene, Taylor, and now Smith were roaming the streets when they spotted 18-year-old Danita Goulet, who was using the phone booth. Keene and Smith would approach her with their guns and ordered her to take off her shoes. Once she followed their commands, the two men shot Danita. Smith would take her jacket and shoes and flee the scene. Police would be called and found a disposable ammunition called Blazer, which is not usually used for homicides and robberies. It is most common for things like target practice. Unfortunately, though, this would be the only clue police would be able to gather. After this, the group would flee to Heather's home, where Smith would give Taylor Danita's jacket and Smith would keep the shoes. Later that night, 3 more people would come over to the house, which was 16-year-old Wendy Cottrell, her boyfriend Marvin Washington, and Matthew's ex-boyfriend, 28-year-old Jeffrey Wright. While hanging out, though, Jeffrey and Matthews would begin to argue, which led to DeMarcus wanting to protect his girlfriend, shooting Jeffrey multiple times. However, only one out of the multiple shots would be successful, which hit him in the leg. Jeffrey would end up leaving and shuffle his way over to a neighbor's house to get help. In fear of having the police call on them, the group would flee the scene again, in the same car that they took the previous night. On Christmas Day, Taylor decided she wanted to go kill and rob her ex-boyfriend, Richmond Maddox. Taylor would go to Richmond's parents' house and lure him outside, and the two would get into his truck. As they were driving down the street, Maddox noticed that the car that the group was in was following them, which caused him to speed up. However, while he began speeding up, Taylor took out her gun and shot him in the temple. After shooting him, she quickly grabbed some cash from him and jumps out of the car with mild injuries. Moments later, the car Maddox was then crashed into a tree. Law enforcement again would show up, but the only information they were given was that a young African-American female was seen fleeing the car. Unfortunately, at the time, police were unable to figure out who committed the murder. On December 26th, the group would go to an ATM where they failed to rob someone, so then they would drive to a gas station where they began shooting at Kathy Henderson, and luckily she was able to escape unharmed. Afterwards, they would steal her car and drive to a mini market. Taylor would go into the store and buy gum and a bottle of juice. Taylor would begin talking to the cashier, who was Sarah Abraham, and she was 38 years old. It turns out that her and her family owned the mini mart. Another man was there, which was 70-year-old Jimmy Thompson. It turns out that he bought Taylor the juice that she wanted because she didn't have enough money. Soon after, Keene and Smith would barge into the store and hold Sarah at gunpoint and order her to empty the cash register. She handed the around $40 in cash to Keene. Right after, though, he shot her in the head and began shooting at a few other people in the store. Luckily, Thompson was able to survive the incident because he fell to the ground and pretended to be dead. The 2 other people that they shot luckily survived the incident. Sarah was brought to the hospital where she would unfortunately pass away from her injuries a few days later. Police would arrive at the crime scene and begin gathering blood samples, and there they would find the same shell casings found at Danita's crime scene. Thompson would go over to the police and begin telling them everything that happened and the physical description of the suspects involved. The group would then go pick up Wendy and Marvin, which were the 2 hanging out with the group the night that Jeffrey was shot. They would drive to a gravel pit and start berating the 2 about if they knew anything, and ask them if they had told police. This wouldn't be enough proof for Keene and Smith, so Smith shot Marvin and Keene shot Wendy, and unfortunately they would meet the same fate as all their other victims. Now, after each of the killings that the group had committed, they would swap the license plate on their car so they wouldn't be recognized. So the group would go to a gas station to steal another car, and they were unfortunately successful by holding a woman at gunpoint and robbing her. They would steal her Dodge Shadow, swapping the license plate, and drive off. At this time, Police Sergeant John Huber was driving around the town when he spotted the Dodge Shadow. He would request a plate check on the car, and when it came back that it didn't match, they went after the car. While he was following the vehicle, Smith would jump out and run off, but the police decided they would follow the car and look for Smith later. He would eventually pull the car over, and once he got to the window, he noticed the multiple guns in the car. He ordered them to get out of the car, which they cooperated with, and they were all arrested. Police would also discover the belongings of the victims that the group had killed. Smith would also be found at a house nearby, and he was also arrested. Each of the members of the group were charged with 2 counts of aggravated murder, which in total the entire group was charged with 8 counts. In the end, Smith, Taylor, and Matthews were all given life sentences. Taylor and Matthews are currently serving their sentences at the Ohio Reformatory for Women, and Smith is serving his sentence at the Mansfield Correctional Institute. Keene was given the death penalty and was executed by lethal injection on July 21st, 2009.
Ramirez entered the courtroom wearing sunglasses and shackles. He's accused of 43 crimes, including 13 murders and multiple counts of rape, robbery, sodomy, and oral copulation.
Richard Ramirez was born February 29, 1960 in El Paso, Texas. He was born as the youngest of his 4 other siblings. He was born to Mexican immigrants Julian and Mercedes Ramirez. To say Richard grew up in a troubled home was an understatement. It's been reported that Julian was physically abusive to Richard, which resulted in him sustaining multiple head injuries when he was younger. To escape his abusive household, Richard would often spend time with his older cousin Miguel, who was a Vietnam veteran. It was reported that when Richard was only 12 years old, Miguel showed him images of a Vietnamese woman that he raped and killed. And then when Richard was only 13, he found out that Miguel shot and killed his wife, which he became a witness to. However, Miguel was found not guilty due to insanity and was released only 4 years later. As Richard grew older, he began breaking into homes, and he developed a drug addiction, which would cause his first arrest in 1977 for marijuana possession. He would then move to Los Angeles, California, where there he would commit his first murder. Before I continue, it is believed by many people that Richard's first murder was in April 1984, which was the murder of 9-year-old Mae Lane. Many people believe this due to the fact that DNA testing proved that Richard was at the crime scene at the time of the murder. This murder was talked about during the court case, however, for some reason, he was not charged with it. His first murder that he has officially been charged with was in June 1984, in which he killed a 79-year-old woman who is a widow. She was reportedly raped and stabbed to death. He would then take an 8-month hiatus from killing until he decided he would commit another murder. On March 17, 1985, Richard would go after Marina Hernandez and her roommate, Dale Okazaki. Maria was outside her condominium when she heard a noise behind her. She turned around and saw Richard standing there threatening her with a gun. He then pointed to her head and pulled the trigger. Luckily though, she quickly brought her right hand up to her head to protect her from the shot, which saved her life. As she laid there though, she heard a gunshot ring out. She then quickly went over to hide behind the car, but she then heard Richard leaving the condominium. Richard would then discover her hiding, in which he threatened her with his gun again. She begged for him not to shoot her, and eventually he dropped the gun and ran away. Once he left, Maria ran into the condominium, and there she would discover Dale on the kitchen floor, and she was deceased. That same day, Tae Leanne Yu was driving home when Richard stopped her, which he then proceeded to shoot and kill her. Just over a week later, Richard would take 2 people's lives, which is 44-year-old Maxine Zazzara and her 64-year-old husband, Vincent Zazzara. The crime scene for this murder was much more gruesome than all the other murders. Richard shot Vincent, and then Maxine was assaulted and stabbed to death. It was also reported that Maxine's eyes were gouged out of her head. During this time, a massive search was out for this unknown killer, and results were basically non-existent. However, they were able to make a police sketch of what they thought the killer looked like. The attraction this killer, or Richard, was getting led to him leaving Los Angeles and moving to San Francisco, California. On August 24th, 1985, Richard would break into a home where he would rape the woman in the house and shoot her fiancé. However, unknowingly to Richard, a witness spotted him breaking into the home, and they would take note of the car's license plate that Richard arrived in. The witness would give the license plate number to police, and the victim would give police her description of what the killer looked like. A few days later, law enforcement would come across the abandoned vehicle, which had Richard's fingerprints. DNA testing would finally reveal the identity of this killer, which was, of course, Richard Ramirez. On August 31st, 1985, Richard was finally arrested after he tried to run from police, but was beaten by a group of people after trying to steal a car. Finally, in early 1989, Richard's trial would begin, and by September of that year, he would be charged with 13 counts of murder and was given the death penalty. However, during his trial, a juror that was working on the case was found murdered. Theories were spread that Richard somehow orchestrated for someone outside of the prison to kill this juror, when it was proven that the murder was not tied to Richard at all. He was scheduled to be killed by the gas chamber on November 7th, 1989. However, that penalty would never be carried out because almost 25 years later, on June 7, 2013, Richard would finally pass away from complications of B-cell lymphoma.
Hey, what's happening?
The Cracklins, what's happening? Pop Rock says bang to the bite.
Dean Corll was born December 24th, 1939 in Fort Wayne, Indiana, to parents Arnold and Mary Corll. Unfortunately, Dean and his younger brother's parents never had a happy marriage. The parents would often get into arguments, but according to outsiders, these arguments never got physical. During the 1940s, physical punishment was a common form of punishment across many households, which was no different from Arnold, who would enforce these types of punishments on his children. However, Mary was the complete opposite, and in what information is known to the public, she did not inflict any physical punishment. Unfortunately, as time passed on, the arguing persisted in the marriage, which led to their divorce in 1946. They would briefly get back together, but after the couple's second divorce, it would stay permanent. The custody of the 2 children would be given to Mary, in which she worked many jobs to support her family. During this time, Dean would be infected with rheumatic fever, which is a lifelong disease that can inflame or swell the heart, brain, skin, and joints. The disease would leave Dean with a heart condition, which caused him to constantly miss school. It is reported, though, that during school, Dean was an ordinary student with decent grades. Eventually, Mary would decide to remarry and also move down to Texas to continue raising their children. Once the family moved down to Texas, Mary and her husband would begin a part-time candy business called Pecan Prince out of their garage. Dean's stepfather was a traveling salesman and would begin selling the candy on his route while Mary would handle the business side. The business turned out to be a big success, and it became the main source of income for the family, and they would eventually open up a candy shop. Dean would begin working at the candy shop, but eventually in 1964, Dean wanted to enlist into the military despite his heart condition. However, after only 10 months, Dean would leave the military and return home to help his mother at the candy shop. In 1969, when Dean was around 30, he began noticing signs of homosexuality. This would lead to him starting to spend time with underage teen boys and giving them free candy. One boy Dean hung out with was named David Owen Brooks. Brooks recounted that in 1970, he went to Dean's apartment and found Dean nude with two naked boys strapped to a homemade torture rack that Dean supposedly made himself. Once Brooks walked in, Dean released the two and said that if Brooks kept quiet, he would give him a car. He also said if Brooks began bringing boys to his home, he would pay him $200, in which Brooks agreed. Brooks would eventually lure a boy named Elmer Wayne Henley to Dean's home. Once Dean saw the boy, he decided he wouldn't kill him, but he would sexually assault him and turn him into another accomplice. Like he said to Brooks, he said to Henley that every boy he brought to him, he would pay him $200. That same year, Dean would commit his first murder, which was Jeffrey Conan, who was a college student. In December of that year, Dean would kill two more people, which is 14-year-old James Glass and 15-year-old David Yates. Between January 1971 to July 1973, Dean would kill and torture 6 more victims who were all children. During this time as well, Brooks and Henley would assist in luring these children to Dean's home. However, this would all change on August 8, 1973. Pasadena police would receive a phone call from Elmer Henley. He said he had shot and killed Dean Corll in self-defense at Dean's home. Once police arrived, they found Dean with 6 bullet holes in his shoulders and back. According to Henley, he said that he had lured Tim Curley and Rhonda Williams to Dean's home. Henley, Curley, and Williams would all drink together until they passed out. Once Henley woke up, he realized that him and the 2 other people he was drinking with were tied up. Dean would bring Henley into the kitchen, and while threatening him with a gun, would lecture him about bringing a girl to the home. Henley began pleading to be untied, promising he would assist in killing the 2 other victims tied up. Dean would eventually agree and untie him, and then put his gun down to go tie up his next 2 victims to his torture rack. Once Dean was distracted, though, Henley would grab the gun and fire 6 shots into his shoulders and back. Soon after the discovery of Dean's body, a full investigation would be launched. By the end of Dean's horrific killing spree, 27 victims were found, with Henley saying that there was at least 4 more victims, but police would call off the search. Soon after, 17-year-old Elmer Wayne Henley and 18-year-old David Owen Brooks would confess about their involvement in the kidnappings, murders, and torture that these children experienced. The 2 were taken to court, where in the end Henley was convicted of 6 murders and was given 6 life sentences, and Brooks was convicted of 1 murder and was given a life sentence. At one point in recent years, Henley had started a Facebook page in which he advertised his artwork while in prison. From what I found to this day, Henley's Facebook account has been taken down. In 2020, it was reported that David Owen Brooks had passed away in prison from COVID-19. Currently, Elmer Wayne Henley is still serving his life sentence. Kendall Francois was born July 26, 1971 in Poughkeepsie, New York to parents Paulette and McKinley Francois. Kendall played football during his high school career, and once he graduated in the summer of 1989, he would enlist into the U.S. Army. In 1993, Kendall would leave the military and enroll into Dutchess County Community College, in which he would begin majoring in liberal arts. However, during his college career, he would begin cheating on his assignments to move forward with his degree. In 1996, Kendall would get a job at a middle school working as a hall and detention monitor. According to teachers, Kendall would apparently make sexual jokes to female students, and he would also touch their hair. Soon after, though, Kendall would begin his horrific killing spree. It all began on October 24th of that year, in which he solicited a prostitute, which was 30-year-old Wendy Myers. The 2 met at Valley Rest Motel, where inside a hotel room, Kendall would proceed to crush Wendy's neck until the bone in her neck snapped, which killed her. Afterwards, he would take her body and store it in his home. Over a month later, on November 29th, Kendall would kill his next victim, which was 29-year-old Jana Barone, who was a prostitute. He would do the same thing he did to Wendy, and once he killed her, he would again bring the body back to his home. Between January 1997 to June 1998, he would kill 3 more victims and keep their bodies in his home. Without crime scenes to these kidnappings and murders, police couldn't do anything and had no leads. However, this would all change in August of 1998. Kendall would target and kill 2 more victims, which were 34-year-old Audrey Pugliese and 25-year-old Cantina Newmaster. Detectives Bob McCready and Skip Manane noticed that this killer had been targeting victims in the same area of Poughkeepsie. This small detail led to police beginning to patrol the area. On September 1st, McCready and Manane were at a gas station when someone ran up to them claiming that a man had been assaulting a woman nearby. They would soon discover this attacker was Kendall Francois. They would arrest him and bring him in for questioning. Eventually, into his interrogation, police were able to get him to confess to the kidnappings and murders of these women. The day after, on September 2nd, police were granted a search warrant to investigate Kendall's home, where they would find the gruesome discovery of 8 corpses that Kendall had been hiding in his home. Kendall would plead guilty on 8 counts of murder and was also charged for the assault on September 1st. In August of 2000, Kendall was given life in prison, but it turns out that Kendall was infected with HIV from one of his victims, but he passed away from natural causes on September 11th, 2014. Gary Ridgway was born on February 18, 1949 in Salt Lake City, Utah. His father, Thomas, worked as a bus driver, and his mother, Mary, worked as a sales clerk. According to Gary, when he was younger, he would wet the bed, and whenever he did, his mother would wash his genitals, even when Gary was a young teen. This caused him to become sexually attracted to his mother, and he also fantasized about killing her. Okay, I have to interrupt. What is this? After graduating high school in the late 1960s, he would enlist into the U.S. Navy and went to Vietnam. After serving for 2 years, he would return back to America, where there he would move to Seattle, Washington. Gary would find a job working as a truck painter and kept the job for 30 years. In 1980, Gary would be accused for choking a prostitute. However, he said that the woman had bit him, which afterwards they basically were like, abandoned the accusation. His second arrest would soon be made after he was caught trying to solicit a prostitute. In July 1982, Gary kidnapped and murdered a 16-year-old girl named Wendy Caulfield. Once he kidnapped her, he would proceed to strangle her to death and dumped her body in the Green River. After 4 more bodies were found, King County Sheriff Dave Richart would be the first detective assigned to the case and begin looking over evidence and testing it with DNA technology. On August 15th, 3 more bodies would again be discovered at Green River. The 3 victims were 16-year-old Opa Mills, 17-year-old Cynthia Hins, and 31-year-old Marcy Chapman. At this point, an entire police task force was looking for this unknown serial killer, but leads were non-existent. That would change in 1983 when a missing prostitute went missing, and Gary was brought in as a suspect. A witness reported that they saw the woman get into Gary's truck. Gary would deny everything and took a polygraph test in which he passed. However, the police weren't entirely convinced of Gary's innocence and discovered the charge he was given for solicitation, and this raised police suspicion of Gary being the killer. During this time, the amount of killings would continue to rise, and desperation from police to find this killer would also rise. They eventually decided they would go talk to serial killer Ted Bundy. Earlier, Ted had written a letter to Dave Richart, the main detective of the case, and offered to help him. In 1986, Richard would fly to Florida where Ted was incarcerated and he would meet with him. Ted would say that he was reading about the killer in prison, and he thought that the killer had been going back to where he had been burying the bodies and performing sexual acts on the corpses. Ted suggested that police stake out by recent burial sites to see if this killer would come back and eventually commit these sexual acts. Eventually, in 1987, after years of being a suspect, police were able to gain a search warrant for Gary Ridgway's home and work. Unfortunately, though, police couldn't find any items linking Gary to the killings. Gary would also provide a DNA sample, but DNA testing wasn't advanced enough at the time for where they could link Gary to the murders. This would cause Gary to be a free man for 14 years until 2001, when police were finally able to arrest him. That year, law enforcement would again go over evidence and use forensic testing to link Gary to these murders. Eventually, testing came back, stating that Gary's DNA matched to the evidence found at the crime scene, and on November 30th, 2001, Gary Ridgway was finally arrested. Gary would state that he was innocent, but eventually he would admit to his horrific killing spree. The reason he would mostly target sex workers is because he thought that they wouldn't be reported missing, and he had a hatred for sex workers as well. In the end, Gary Ridgway was charged for the murders of 48 women. In 2003, he would take a plea deal in which he was given 48 consecutive life sentences without any chance of parole. Currently, Gary Ridgway is still alive and is 74 years old. Andrei Chikatilo was born on October 16, 1936, in the USSR, which is now modern-day Ukraine. During the 30s, Ukraine experienced the Holodomor, which was caused by low harvest and caused millions of Ukrainians to starve and die. It got so bad that people began eating other people just to survive. According to Andre's mother, their neighbors reportedly had kidnapped and eaten Andre's older brother. However, this story has never been confirmed. He also struggled at school by getting constantly bullied. Andre had multiple suicide attempts, and he was very socially awkward around people. During this time as well, Andre tried having relationships, but they would never last. Once Andre grew older in 1957, he enlisted into the military, and after serving 3 years in 1960, he would leave. As things began changing for the better for Andre, like getting married in 1963, and began to take literature classes, that would all change in 1971. Andre would begin teaching at a boarding school, and during that time he had begun sexually assaulting his students. This type of behavior would continue on as he transferred between schools, until finally he was fired. However, by September 1978, Andre began having urges to kill children, and unfortunately he would follow through with those urges that month. 9-year-old Yelena Zakatanova's body was found by the Grushivka River. I'm very sorry if I butchered that. An autopsy soon revealed that she had been stabbed and strangled to death. For this crime, a 25-year-old man named Alexander Kravchino, who had previously been charged with rape, was falsely accused for this murder, and 7 years later, in 1984, he was sentenced to death. Andre wouldn't kill for the next 3 years, and during these 3 years he was still trying to find a teaching job but had no results. He eventually became a clerk, and in 1981 he would commit his next murder. On September 3rd, he targeted 17-year-old Larisa Takachino by stabbing and strangling her to death. Andre would begin gaining his victims' trust by talking to them at bus stops and train stations, and luring them to forested areas where he would then kill them. After he did his killings, he had apparently eaten some of the organs in the body. Obviously, these killings gained media attention, which led to an investigation being launched. Mikhail Fetisov would begin leading this case, where he began looking at the mentally ill, sex offenders, and prisoners as possible suspects for these killings. However, when police began interrogating these people, they would often get false confessions. As more killings persisted, police were able to determine that the killer's blood type was AB due to DNA left at these different crime scenes. By 1984, 15 victims had been taken by this killer, and police still had no leads despite their efforts growing. However, police arrested Andre that same year after he was caught molesting a girl at a train station. Andre was brought in and he took a DNA test, where it turns out that police messed up on the DNA testing on Andre, so it looked like his DNA did not match the serial killer's DNA. Andre was also carrying around a briefcase in which it was discovered that he was carrying around things like knives that he had stolen. Andre was given 1 year in prison, and after he got out, he began killing again. After he got out, Andre would stop luring people from public train stations and began killing outside of Rostov, which is the city where he was doing his killings at. Police were desperate to look for this killer, but finally on November 6, 1990, after taking his final victim, a police officer noticed that Andre had been acting suspicious and took down his name and found out about his arrest in 1984. Finally, on November 20th, 1990, Andre Chikatilo was arrested. After being interrogated, Andre would confess to 52 murders. A court case would pursue, where Andre Chikatilo was charged with 52 counts of murder and was sentenced to death. On February 14th, 1994, Andre's sentence would be carried out, and he would die by a single gunshot wound to the head.
Person means fun. Juggling. Not bad, huh? And surprises. And don't forget, smile.
John Hambrick and Susan Lichtman, weeknights at 6 and 11 on News 4.
Shitsuo Matsumoto was born on March 2nd, 1955 in Japan. Shitsuo was born with congenital glaucoma, which resulted in him not being able to see in one eye. Because of this, Shitsuo was sent off to a school for the blind, and while there he gained the reputation for being a bully and stealing his classmates' money. Shitsuo would eventually take the occupation of whatever that is. I cannot pronounce that word, I'm very sorry. But it is a form of therapy that uses needles to puncture the skin to control pain. He would also become a masseur, which is someone who gives massages. However, in 1976, Shitsuo would be convicted and charged $150 for causing bodily injury. Soon after this event in 1977, Shitsuo decided he wanted to go to college and would relocate to Tokyo. He would enroll and be accepted into Tokyo University, and while there he met Tomoka Ishii. The two would begin dating, and eventually the two announced they were having a baby, and they were getting married. Shituo's parents did not approve of the marriage. He would eventually take his university entrance exam, which he would fail. As a result, he would open the Matsumoto Acupuncture Clinic, which would become a massive success for him. Because of the success, he opened a pharmacy which sold Chinese medicine. During this time as well, he began studying New Age religions by reading old Buddhist texts. In 1981, he would join the Aganshu, which is a religious movement. The movement taught its followers to completely cut off their families and commit their life to the cult. In June 1982, Shitsuo violated the Drug, Cosmetics, and Medical Instruments Act, which resulted in him being arrested and charged with $2,000. This charge caused him embarrassment, which led to him being more obsessed with the religion. He began reading about fortune telling, practicing yoga, practicing the human potential movement, reading about the writings of Nostradamus, and began studying about divination and mysticism. After 3 years of being in the Aganshu religion, Shitsuo decided he would depart from the religion and open a yoga school called Inc. He would gain some clients, and he would begin teaching his beliefs to them. At the time, the cult was not yet following religion, and instead believed that yoga gave you psychic abilities. Shitsuo began stating that he was a source of spiritual power, and started conducting ceremonies where he pressed his thumb to his followers' forehead to remove any negative energy in their bodies. In 1985, and he would claim that he met an old man who told him that an apocalypse would arrive sometime in the future. In 1986, on the trip to India, he claimed the same thing happened. Because of what he was told, he decided he would save the world. He would then title his cult of 35 followers Shinshin no Kai, which translates to Mountain Wizards. As his preachings continued, he began brainwashing his followers with the statement that he could save the world from a future apocalypse. However, he stated that he needed to open centers around the world in order to do this. This would lead to his followers being encouraged to donate with the promise of being let into the cult. Shitsuo would eventually begin a monastic community in September of 1986, where the monks and nuns in the community had to cut off all ties to their loved ones. With the money that his followers were brainwashed into giving, he would begin buying properties and constructing villages on top of them to house his followers. In July 1987, 2 major changes would be made to the cult. They would rename to Shinriko, which translates to Teaching of Truth. Shitsuo would change his name to Shoko Asahara due to his religious beliefs. In August 1988, a commune was created by Shoko near Mount Fuji. After this opening, a shift in Shoko's mind would ensue, with him thinking instead of saving the world, he would only save the chosen few, which would be his cult. Eventually, Shoko would begin performing a new ceremony, which would be his followers drinking his blood to get his good karma. The belief was that his followers' bad karma would be replaced with good karma after drinking his blood. In September 1988, Teriyaki Majima, who was a follower of the cult, would end up passing away from drowning. Shoko's response to this would be concern for the public negativity that would be brought to the cult. After having a meeting with his followers, he and the rest of them decided to not report it. They instead would start a fire and burn the remains. In April of 1989, the cult would apply for the Tokyo Prefecture for legal recognition under the Religious Corporations Law. This application, if approved, would give the cult benefits such as legal protection and tax breaks. However, protesters of the cult would begin to argue with the fact that there are underage monks and nuns in the cult. This would lead to the application from the cult to be denied. After this decision, the cult made a massive effort to try to reverse the decision, like threatening to sue Tokyo's governor, and unfortunately, the decision would be switched in August of 1989. In February of 1990, elections for the national legislature in Japan, also known as the National Diet of Japan, would take place. Before these elections were conducted, candidates could spend time setting up rallies to hopefully win these elections. In mid-1989, Shoko decided he wanted to put 25 of his followers as candidates in the election, just so that he could have more power in Japan. In the start, it was going good. His candidates had many great rallies, and it seemed things for Shoko were going up. However, magazine companies began posting negative opinions on the cult in their magazines. These magazines led to a group of protesters to form together and call themselves the Shinriko Victim Society. They also hired a lawyer named Tsutsumi Sakamoto as their legal representative. Sakamoto would launch an investigation and found that the cult were committing multiple acts of fraud. Instead of trying to shut down the cult, Sakamoto just wanted them to stop performing these illegal acts and arranged a meeting with them on October 31st, 1989. However, the meeting led to no results, with the cult not wanting to compromise. Sakamoto decided he was going to press charges against the cult. After hearing this verdict, the cult decided they would kill Sakamoto. They would have a meeting about the assassination, and they determined they would make it look like he died from natural causes. In the early hours of November 4th, 1989, some of the followers would break into Sakamoto's house to kill him. However, after breaking in, they decided to kill Sakamoto and the 2 other family members in the house. After the murders, they would take the bodies and bury them. After the disappearance of Sakamoto, people would obviously question if the cult was tied to it, which led to even more negative ideas about the cult. Luckily, once the elections arrived in February of 1990, none of Shoko's candidates would be elected. That same year, the cult began experimenting with a deadly chemical known as C-botulinum. After gaining a large amount of this chemical, the cult decided to perform an attack. They sent out 3 trucks with the goal of spraying it at the Japanese Diet, Narita Airport, the Imperial Palace, the building of a rival religious group, and 2 U.S. naval bases. Shoko claimed to his followers that the reason they were doing this was that the people at these places were not able to be saved. However, this attack would luckily fail due to issues with the chemicals. Despite this failed attack, they still kept producing these harmful chemicals for the next 5 years. During that time, the cult would try to conduct more failed assassinations, but the production of these chemicals only grew stronger. On June 27, 1994, Shoko sent out some of his followers with a chemical called sarin into a neighborhood. Sarin has no color, you can't smell it, and with less than an ounce on the skin, it can kill somebody. The reason some of the followers were in this neighborhood is because the cult had gotten into a court case over a real estate dispute. From how the case was looking, it was a huge possibility that 3 of the judges were not going to side with the cult. Because of this, Shoko decided he was going to send out his followers to the neighborhood these 3 judges lived in to kill them. Once in the neighborhood, the deadly gas would be released into the air, where it killed 7 people and 500 people were rushed to the hospital. The cult would then flee the area and move to a rural community. On March 20th, 1995, the cult decided they were going to commit another mass killing. On that day, they planted plastic bags with sarin in them on 5 different trains in the Tokyo subway system. Once these chemicals took effect, multiple train stations had thousands of people crying for help. By the end of that day, 15 train stations were affected. Almost 3,800 people were injured, with around 1,000 going to the hospital. And by the end of this tragic event, it was recorded that 12 people had died from the attack. From March to September of 1995, police made multiple arrests on different cult members, including Shoko Asahara, and began collecting multiple pieces of evidence. Followers of the cult were charged with multiple offenses, such as conspiracy, kidnapping, murder, and assault. The day Shoko was arrested on May 16, 1995, a letter containing a bomb was mailed to the governor of Tokyo. The bomb ended up blowing off his left hand and multiple of his fingers. 5 followers of the cult would be found guilty of this attempted assassination. From what I found, the cult conducted its final attack on July 4th, 1995. They would again use 2 chemicals named sulfuric acid and sodium cyanide to try to commit another mass murder. Luckily, the devices they made for these chemicals failed to work. It is reported that 100 to 300 members of the cult were arrested and charged with an offense. One of those was Shoko, who was found guilty of murder and sentenced to death in 2004. However, it wouldn't be until July 6, 2018, when Shoko was finally executed by hanging. In this trailer, multiple victims of a serial killer known as David Parker Ray were brought here. However, before we dive into Parker's horrific killing spree, let's look at his earlier life. David Parker Ray was born on November 6, 1939 in Belen, New Mexico. Not much is known about his childhood, except that he was raised by his grandfather, and his father would often visit him, who was physically abusive towards Parker. As he grew into his teen years, he began having urges of raping and torturing girls, and would gain an addiction to alcohol and drugs. However, when Parker got older, he would go serve in the U.S. Army. After leaving the military from an honorable discharge, he would move back to New Mexico, where he would find work as a mechanic with the New Mexico State Parks. To this day, it is not entirely known when Parker began his killing spree, but it is believed to be sometime in the 1950s. Over 40 years later, in the 1990s, Parker would construct a soundproof trailer that would be used to torture and kill his victims. He would call this trailer his toy box, which would give him the name of the toy box killer. Parker would disguise himself as a cop or some other authoritative figure and lure his victims to his trailer. And once they were there, Parker would drug them and torture them. Parker would use weapons such as whips and chains to torture his victims. He also had an entire machine dedicated to immobilizing his victims, while he and some other accomplices, like his girlfriend, would abuse them. Fortunately, Parker's killing spree would end when one of the girls he kidnapped escaped. Her name was Cynthia Vigil, and she was 22 years old at the time of her abduction. Cynthia was working as a prostitute when Parker pulled up to where she was standing and offered her $20 for sex, and Cynthia would get into the car. Once she got in, she noticed Parker's girlfriend Cindy Hendy. However, before she could get out of the car, Parker showed Cynthia his fake badge and told her she was under arrest for solicitation. After the badge, the two would bound, gag, and place a steel collar around her neck. Once she arrived at the trailer, she was tortured and raped multiple times. On March 22nd, 1999, 3 days after the abduction, Parker would have to leave the trailer for a little bit and put Hendy in charge of watching her. Cynthia was chained to a pole, and nearby lay a set of keys that would unlock the chains. Hendy would luckily go to another room, and once she left, Cynthia would quickly grab the keys and break herself free from the pole. Cynthia would locate a phone in the trailer and make an attempt to call the police, but Hendy, hearing the noise, would quickly leave the room she was in. She grabbed a lamp that was nearby and threw it at Cynthia's head, knocking her to the ground. Hendy would hang up the phone, and while she was doing that, Cynthia would grab an ice pick and threaten her with it. Hendy would back away, which gave Cynthia just enough time to escape the trailer. Cynthia began running down the dirt road and was screaming for help. However, the two cars that passed by dodged her. However, she would eventually find a mobile home that had its door open. She would run inside and slam the door behind her. The woman inside was shocked, but seeing how injured Cynthia was, she helped her. The two would call 911, and after Cynthia told officers the location of the trailer, they said they had already driven to the trailer to check it out due to the earlier 911 call that was placed when Cynthia was being attacked. Luckily, soon after, police arrested Parker and Hendy. Evidence against Parker and his other accomplices would quickly build up. Another woman who survived was Angelica Montano, and she would come forward with her testimony against Parker. Police would also get Hendy to confess more information about the kidnappings and murders. Luckily, Parker's other accomplices in these horrific crimes would be revealed as well. Parker's friend Dennis Yancey and Parker's own daughter Glenda Ray were all connected in participating in these kidnappings. At the end of the trial, Parker was sent to 223 years in prison. Unfortunately, though, he barely served any time in prison because shortly after his sentencing on May 28, 2002, he died from a heart attack. Hendy was given 36 years in prison, and Glenda was given 9 years. However, for some reason, these two were released early, and to this day, they walk free. Dennis was given 2 15-year terms after being found guilty of the murder of one of the victims, Marie Parker.
These men are aviation cadets. A short while ago, they too were average American boys from average American families.
Marcel Pidiot was born January 17, 1897 in Auxerre, France. During Marcel's childhood, he was described as being very intelligent. However, he had multiple behavioral issues as well. Eventually, in 1917, Marcel would enlist into the army, which, while there, was caught trying to steal blankets, but was found not guilty due to insanity and would continue to serve. Eventually, though, his behavior would cause him to be discharged. After his time in the military, Marcel would enroll into college and be accepted. He would graduate with a medical degree in 1921, which led to him opening a practice in Villeneuve, France. Marcel would find a lot of success in this town, and in 1926, he won the election for mayor. However, in 1931, Marcel was suspended as mayor for fraud, and soon after he resigned. Only a year later, he was accused of stealing electricity, and yes, that is a crime, but by that point, he had already relocated to Paris. Once he arrived in Paris, he would open another practice where he would gain customers by using fake credentials. Again, though, he would be accused of committing more crimes, such as overprescribing medication to patients and performing illegal abortions. Despite these allegations, in 1936, he was granted permission to begin writing death certificates. In 1940, he would write fake disability statements for people who were drafted for forced labor in Germany, which he would be caught for. Again though, he would get off with just a fine of 2,400 francs, which francs were the old currency that was used in France, and they were eventually changed to euros. During World War II, Marcel would begin conducting his killings with the goal of getting money from his victims. He would do this by promising Jews that he would help them escape from France, which was occupied by the Nazis at that time. Instead though, he would give his victims poison that he said would protect them from disease. This poison would be cyanide. Once the victims died, he would take all their cash and possessions and would dispose of the bodies. He would begin leaving the bodies in the Seine River, but would later either burn the bodies in this furnace or use a chemical called quicklime to help decompose the bodies faster. These killings would be conducted until in March of 1944, when neighbors noticed a large amount of smoke coming out of the chimney in Marcel's home. Once police and firefighters arrived at the home, they discovered a scene of fire that had erupted in a coal stove. They also uncovered human remains in the quicklime pit and in different bags. The possessions of the victims were found during the search as well. By the end of the investigation, over 30 bodies were discovered on Marcel's property. Once he was arrested, he would try to defend himself by saying that the bodies were Nazis. Obviously, authorities wouldn't believe this with the amount of evidence against Marcel, and he was taken to court. During his court case, he confessed to over 60 murders, but he was only charged with 27. He was sentenced to death, and on May 25, 1946, Marcel was beheaded from the guillotine.
As of recent reports, the unidentified serial killer that has been terrorizing Los Angeles is still on the loose. Recent victims have been described as young women who were looking for work in the entertainment industry. Unfortunately, at this time, a description of this serial killer is still unknown.
Harvey Glattman was born on December 10, 1927 in New York City, but soon after him and his family would move to Denver, Colorado. According to his mother, when Glattman was only 4, he began choking himself with rope. In school, Glattman was bullied and he was known to be shy around girls. When Glattman was an early teen, he had already begun committing crimes such as breaking into women's apartments and stealing their lingerie and other items. In 1945, Glattman would move back to New York and while there was arrested for sexual assault. Despite his parents begging the judge to not send him to prison, he would ignore them and sentence Glattman to 5 to 10 years in a correctional facility. While in the facility, he was diagnosed with schizophrenia. He would use this to his advantage and successfully manipulated authoritative figures that he was a different person, and as a result, he was released early. After being released, Glattman would return back to Denver and lived with his parents until they passed away in the 50s. In 1957, he would relocate to Los Angeles, where he would open a television repair store. He would also gain an interest in photography, and he would practice tying ropes. Glattman would begin posting his services as a photographer into magazines to hopefully attract female actresses who were hopeful for a future in Hollywood. He would say that his photography would help boost themselves into the Hollywood scene. 19-year-old Judy Dole would be the first victim to reach out to Glattman to do a photo shoot. Once they met up, he convinced her to come with him to his apartment, where inside she would be beaten, tied up, and sexually assaulted by Glattman. He would then take pictures of her and drive out to the desert, where she would be strangled to death. He would do the same thing to 2 more women, which were Ruth McCardo and Shirley Bridgeford. On October 27, 1958, Glattman would convince Lorraine Vigil to do a photo shoot with him at his studio. However, once Glattman began driving out of LA, he pulled the car over claiming he had a flat tire, and once he was out, he pulled a gun on Vigil and attempted to tie her up. However, Vigil would begin to fight back, and Glattman would accidentally fire a shot that hit Vigil in the hip, but despite this, she kept on fighting back. While they were fighting, a police officer happened to be driving by and saw the two. The officer would pull over and arrest Glattman and take him in. While in custody, Glattman would confess to officers about the murders, which would lead to a search of his apartment. While searching his apartment, the multiple photographs he took of his victims and items that were taken from his victims were discovered. Glattman was proud of the killings and had no remorse. He would be found guilty, and he was sentenced to death by the gas chamber. His sentence would be carried out on September 18, 1959. It's June 5th, 2002. The sun is a few hours away from rising, and 9-year-old Mary Smart wakes up to a voice in her room. She recognized the voice as a male who was threatening her 14-year-old sister, Elizabeth Smart, which she shared a room with. However, the only thing she could do to protect herself and her family was pretend to go back to sleep. However, once she opened her eyes again, her sister would be absent from the room. A few hours after Elizabeth's abduction, Mary would run into her parents' room to tell them about the horrific event. Once Ed and Lois Smart were awakened by their daughter, they both thought that she was just having a bad dream, but they eventually began searching the house for Elizabeth. After not being able to find Elizabeth anywhere, the worried parents called 911. Once police showed up to the residence, they discovered the intruder had cut the screen in the kitchen window and entered the home. Police dogs would discover Elizabeth's scent would end just a few feet away from the home. With no leads of where she could have gone, police would gather all the family's computers and search them to see if Elizabeth had been talking to anyone online. However, it was soon discovered Elizabeth had not been talking to anyone online. At the time, the family's home was being renovated, which meant multiple workers were around the home almost all day. A few months would pass after the abduction, and police were mostly focused on the workers around the home. Mary would talk to police and she would help them find a person that could be connected to the kidnapping and the sketch of what the kidnapper potentially looked like. The name that was given by Mary was Emmanuel, who was a homeless man that helped on the house for only a day, which was months before Elizabeth's disappearance. Earlier in the investigation, police had considered him as a possible suspect, but due to a typing error in the police system, his name didn't show up. At the time, police weren't interested in taking Emmanuel as a main suspect, and decided to focus on their main suspect, which was Richard Rissy, who police had arrested on June 14, 2002. However, he passed away on August 30th of that year. Eventually, the family had decided to reach out to John Walsh. John's son Adam went missing in 1981, and his remains were discovered shortly after his disappearance. After this horrific tragedy, John would start a TV show named America's Most Wanted that would hopefully help fugitives be caught and arrested. After being contacted, John would run a segment about Elizabeth's case that included the police sketches of the abductor. The night that the broadcast was aired, one of the viewers would be a man named Derek Thompson. Once he saw the police sketches, he believed that his stepdad Brian Mitchell and his mom, Wanda Barzee, were holding Elizabeth hostage. Mitchell's ex-wife would also see the broadcast and recognize the sketch as her ex-husband. The show would run another broadcast on the case, and Thompson would submit pictures of his stepdad to the show. Someone would eventually call in and report that he saw Brian, Wanda, and Elizabeth, but the two women were disguised in robes. Once police arrived at the location they were last seen at, they were gone and fleeing California. It wouldn't be until March 12, 2003, when the three arrived in Sandy, Utah, they were finally arrested. Multiple people had called authorities, stating they saw him in town, and Brian was finally arrested along with Wanda. At first, once Elizabeth was in custody, she claimed that she wasn't Elizabeth Smart, but after showing her the missing persons poster, she admitted her true identity. When Elizabeth was kidnapped, Brian and Wanda put her into a white robe and tied her to a tree in a forest. Brian wanted to marry Elizabeth as a second wife due to an old tradition in the Latter-day Saints Church. Over the 9 months being held captive, Brian manipulated Elizabeth into believing that he was a prophet. It turned out Brian and Emmanuel were the same person, and Brian had been using the fake name. Only 6 days after his arrest, Brian and Wanda were charged with sexual assault, aggravated kidnapping, and aggravated burglary. The two were incompetent to stand trial multiple times, but eventually their trials would commence. Over 6 years after the arrest on November 17, 2009, Wanda would be sentenced to 15 years in prison. In May 2011, over 8 years after the arrest, Brian would be sentenced to life in prison. However, on September 19, 2018, Wanda would be released from prison, and as of that year, she is still free from prison. To this day, Brian is still in prison. Despite this horrific kidnapping, Elizabeth has been able to turn her situation into a positive. She has become a child safety activist and has written and published a book in 2013 called My Story. She is currently married and has 3 children.
Missing.
It's the night of December 8th, 1963, and Frank Sinatra Jr., a new music artist, is performing at the Harrah's Club Lodge on the border of California. After finishing the show, he and one of his friends, John Foss, would go to rest in the dressing room, and once 9 p.m. rolled around, a knock would be heard at the door. The person on the other side of the door claimed they had a package for Junior. However, once answering the door, 2 men would invade the room, tying up Foss and blindfolding Junior. Luckily though, while the 2 abductors were bringing Junior out to the car, Foss would break free from his restraints and flee to call the police. As the abductors were driving to Los Angeles, where they were planning on hiding, they were stopped by police at the roadblock. However, one of the abductors would convince the officer to let him through, and the officer would eventually give in. Once they arrived at their hideout on December 10th, they called Junior's father, Frank Sinatra, to demand $240,000 out of him to safely get his son back. In 2024, this money would be worth over $2 million. Authorities would speak with Sinatra and recommend he pay the ransom, and they would track the money and hopefully catch the abductors. By the next day, the FBI would drop off the money so that the abductors would claim it. Soon after, Junior's captors would finally release him, and luckily he wasn't severely injured. After walking for what probably seemed to be hours, Junior would find a security guard that offered to help him get home. After a few days of Junior's release, one of the captors went out to see their brother. However, once they told their brother what they had done, he decided to alert authorities, and the 3 captors that were involved were arrested. The 3 men would be Barry Keenan, Joe Omsler, and John Irwin. Fortunately, almost all the money was recovered as well. The trial wouldn't begin until February 10th, 1964, and Barry's defense was that he and the family staged the kidnapping just for attention. Obviously, though, this was quickly disproven. By the end of the trial, Barry and Joe were sentenced to life in prison. John was sentenced to 75 years in prison. However, psychiatric observation was conducted on Barry and Joe, and it was found that they were both mentally insane at the time of the crime, which reduced their sentences to just 25 years in prison. However, none of the captors served their full terms. Joe and John only served 3.5 years, and Barry only served 4.5 years in prison. After being released, Barry would begin working in real estate, and in 1998, he published his experience of the kidnapping. Shortly after, in 1999, Columbia Pictures offered Barry $1.5 million to turn his story into a movie. Once Junior heard about this deal, though, he immediately filed a lawsuit. In California, a law exists that states that a felon cannot make profit from turning a crime they committed into some sort of entertainment. Fortunately, Junior would end up winning the case. Barry would eventually die on November 13, 2022. Joe's life after the crime seemed to be private, but what is known is that he died on May 6, 2006. To this day, John's whereabouts seem to be unknown. After the kidnapping, Junior continued his successful career in music until he passed away on March 16, 2016. March 17th, 1977. That was the day the residents of Circleville, Ohio would never forget. Mary Gillespie, a school bus driver who was a mother of 2 and married to her husband, Ron Gillespie, opened her mailbox to discover a letter. The letter stated, "Stay away from Massey. Don't lie when questioned about meeting him. I know where you live. I've been observing your house and know you have children. This is no joke. Please take it serious. Everyone concerned has been notified, and everything will be over soon." The letter contained accusations of Mary having an affair with the West Falls School Superintendent, Gordon Massey. The author of this letter also stated threats of exposing the supposed affair. Mary, however, decided to ignore the letter, even though it contained a lot of personal information about her, like knowing where she lived and her having children. But when a second letter arrived at her home, threatening her again, she alerted authorities. After looking at the letters, though, police had no leads. Just like Mary Gillespie, other residents in Circleville began receiving letters signed by a writer who remained anonymous. Ron Gillespie would eventually start receiving letters that exposed the supposed affair to him. He was determined that Gordon Massey was the real individual behind these letters and would confront him in person on the matter. However, Massey would decline all of it. Mary would eventually focus on one of her co-workers, David Lawnberry, who was another school bus driver. Lawnberry had previously asked Mary out on a date, and when she rejected, he began to act resentful towards her. She eventually decided to reach out to Ron's sister, Karen, and her husband, Paul Freshour, for help. The plan would be for Paul to write a letter to Lawnberry, accusing him of writing the letters. After the letter was sent out, they would suddenly stop appearing in Mary and Ron's mailbox for a few weeks. However, this would all change on August 19, 1977. The phone inside Mary and Ron's house would begin to ring. When Ron answered, his neutral facial expression would turn to anger as he heard the caller on the other end. He would slam the phone back on the receiver, grab his gun, and tell his daughter that he was going to confront the individual who was writing these letters. However, this would be the last time Ron was seen alive, because that same night, Ron's truck would be discovered. The truck had collided into a tree, which would unfortunately kill Ron. Once authorities arrived, they came to the conclusion that he died from a drunk driving accident. However, this explanation didn't make any sense because, according to his family, he hadn't been drinking that day. It was also noted that before he died, he had fired his gun. Soon after Ron's passing, other residents once again began receiving letters, but this time it was an accusation that the sheriff, Dwight Radcliffe, was involved in some sort of cover-up in the case. Radcliffe responded to these allegations, stating that there had been an unknown individual who was involved in the crash, but they passed a polygraph test, and after Ron's autopsy, it was revealed that his BAC was .16, which at .15 and above means that an individual has almost doubled the legal amount in their system. Soon after this tragic event, it was discovered that Mary and Gordon had been having an affair, but Mary would claim the affair would begin after the letters started being sent out. In February 1983, Mary was doing her ordinary bus route when she suddenly stumbled upon a sign. The sign accused Gordon of raping Mary's 12-year-old daughter. Mary would rip the sign down, but once she did, she discovered a gun pointing at her. The sign had a gun attached to it, ready to shoot whoever took it down. Luckily, the gun didn't fire, and Mary alerted authorities. Once police arrived, they traced the gun back to Paul Freshour. When he was brought in for questioning, he said that the gun was stolen, but there were no reports of him reporting it missing. He would then be asked to give police handwriting samples so they could see if they matched the letters. They would use a document that Paul had written in his own handwriting for evidence, and after a handwriting expert went over the documents, they determined that Paul's handwriting was a match to the letters. However, despite the evidence police gathered up against him, Paul was determined to prove that he was framed, but this argument wouldn't change authorities' minds, and he was arrested and found guilty for attempted murder on November 2nd, 1987. He was given a 25-year sentence for this charge as well. However, while in prison, the letters continued to be sent out, and even to Paul himself. The letter that Paul received stated, "Freshour, now when are you going to believe you aren't getting out of there? I told you 2 years ago, when we set them up, they stay set up. Don't you listen at all? No one wants you out. No one. The joke is on you. Tell no one of this letter. I saw the paper. Great news. Great. The sheriff loved it. Do you believe it now? Do you?" Police still had no leads. However, that would all change in 1993 when a serial killer named Thomas Lee Dillon, who was recently arrested, sent a letter to Columbus Dispatch claiming that he was the writer of the Circleville letters. Police would look into this claim and found that Thomas's handwriting was similar to the letters. However, despite the similar handwriting, police couldn't find any other evidence that Thomas was connected to the case. After being in prison for 7 years, Paul would be released on parole in 1994. The last letter was sent out on November 21st, 1994, and it was addressed to a journalist named Mary Mayhew, who was covering the case. The letter was threatening her to stop releasing information about it, and it also threatened her and her family. To this day, the case remains unsolved, and the only thing that remains from it are the multiple theories. Earl Nelson was born on May 12, 1897. Before he even turned 2 years old, Nelson's parents would pass away due to syphilis, and he would be sent to live with his maternal grandmother. When Nelson was around 10 years old, he would be riding his bicycle when suddenly a car would accidentally hit him. This injury would leave him completely unconscious for 6 days, and after he woke up, he wasn't the same. He was mentally unstable, he had frequent headaches, and he suffered from memory loss. His life would become even worse when his grandmother suddenly passed away, and he would be sent to live with his aunt and uncle. When he was around 18, he would break into a cabin that he believed was abandoned, but it turns out it wasn't, and he would be caught and arrested. By the end of his trial in 1915, he would be sentenced to 2 years in San Quentin State Prison. Shortly after this, he would spend a short amount of time in the United States Navy, but during his time there, he seemed very mentally unstable, which caused him to be moved to Napa State Mental Hospital. While in the hospital, he would somehow escape his cell 3 times before hospital staff found him. Eventually, though, he escaped the hospital permanently. On May 19, 1921, Earl would disguise himself as a plumber so that he could break into a house in San Francisco, California. Inside lived Mary Summers, who was only 12 years old at the time. Luckily, before Earl made his way into the home, she began screaming, which caused him to flee, and he would be caught and arrested hours later. After his arrest, he would again be sentenced to Napa State Mental Hospital, but in 1825, he would successfully escape again, and in October of that year, his killing spree would begin. Around that time, Earl would kill 3 women in Philadelphia, which were Ola McCoy, Mae Murray, and Lillian Weiner. Each crime scene looked similar, with each of the victims being found in their home and then being sexually assaulted. It was also noted that each home that Earl invaded had a room for rent sign attached to the window. After these killings, Earl would return to San Francisco, and from February to August of 1926, 5 more women would be murdered. Like the unsolved cases in Philadelphia, these women had a room for rent sign on their homes, and Earl had sexually assaulted the bodies. He would then take his victims' valuables and sell them. At the time, police had no leads, but they did have a description of the potential killer. The killer was described as being a stocky man with long arms and big hands. This description dubbed the unknown serial killer's name as the Gorilla Man, and this name would be used in newspapers. Earl would begin targeting his victims all over North America. Some places his crimes were committed at were Chicago, Kansas City, New York, and Winnipeg, Canada. In Winnipeg, Earl would take the lives of 2 victims, which were 14-year-old Lola Cowan and Emily Patterson. Lola's murder would occur on June 8, 1927, and after committing the murder, Earl stuffed her body underneath her bed and then slept on her bed that night. On June 10th, Earl would attack and kill Emily Patterson. While she was being attacked, she would be able to tear some of Earl's hair off his head before she would succumb to her attacker. After the murder, Earl would go sell some of Emily's and her husband's possessions at a pawn shop. Luckily, once police began investigating this case, they were able to track the items to the pawn shop. After arriving at the shop, the owner told them that Earl had gone to a barber shop, and once they arrived there, the owner told them that the suspected individual had blood in their hair. Thanks to the help of the 2 owners, police were able to get a description which matched Earl's. On June 12th, Earl was planning on committing another murder when he discovered a description of him in the newspaper, which after seeing that, he decided to flee. On June 16th, Earl would be in Killarney, Canada, when a civilian recognized him as a match to the description in the newspaper. Luckily, this tip would help police arrest Earl that same day. However, that night, while in jail, he would pick the lock to his cell door and escape. But the next day, he would again be arrested after he was caught trying to board a train. By the end of his trial, it was confirmed that he was connected to taking the lives of 22 victims, and he would be given the death penalty. His sentence would be carried out on January 13, 1928. It's November 29, 1970, and a father and his 2 daughters were hiking outside of Bergen, Norway. As they were hiking, they made the horrific discovery of a severely burnt woman who was laying on her back with her head pointing towards a valley, which was called the Valley of Death by locals. She was also surrounded by large stones. The 3 would quickly return to civilization, and report the discovery to the police. The investigation would reveal that all the labels on the clothing she was wearing were removed. She had multiple fake identities on her, and she left a bunch of coded messages. Even after using DNA testing on the body, the identity of the woman remained unknown. Investigators began theorizing that maybe the woman caught on fire, and in a panic, she launched herself backwards, or that she might have been murdered. The woman also had jewelry with her, but it had been placed next to her like it was a ritual. Luckily for police, they were able to find some witnesses that were able to describe what the woman looked like. She was described as being around 5'4", long brownish black hair, between 25 to 40 years old, brown eyes, a roundish face, and small ears. Another break in the case would be made just days after the discovery. There were 2 suitcases located at the Bergen Railway Station's luggage department. Inside one of the cases were glasses that had the woman's fingerprint on them. More of the woman's belongings were found, but all of the labels had been removed. Police would look at the coded messages the woman left behind, and luckily they were able to decode them. The messages had the hotels that the woman had stayed at. Throughout the woman's multiple belongings, one of them stood out. It was a pair of boots from Oscar Rortved's footwear store. Police would go and speak to the owner's son, who claimed that he had sold a pair of boots to a woman who was well-dressed, and she had apparently taken a long time to choose a pair. Authorities were also able to trace her back to a hotel, but she had used a fake name to check in, which was Fenella Lorch. It was also later discovered that she had stayed at multiple other hotels, but she had used different fake names at those hotels as well. A waitress at one of the hotels told police that the woman had been staring at her, and she was talking with 2 German Navy personnel. The waitress's story caused authorities to believe that the woman was a spy due to the Cold War going on at that time. The autopsy of the woman would reveal that she had a bruise on her neck, she had smoke particles in her lungs, and there were 50 to 70 sleeping pills in her stomach. However, police were never able to find the woman's identity. In 1971, officers who were working on the case attended the Isdell's woman's funeral. In 2016, the case would be reopened, but even after going over all the evidence, the woman's identity remains unsolved. Richard Chase was born on May 23, 1950, in Sacramento, California. During his childhood, his father, who was an alcoholic, would frequently beat him, which led to him to start killing animals. During his teen years, he would start drinking, doing drugs, and he would be in multiple different relationships with girls, but these relationships wouldn't last long because he couldn't get aroused. Chase would try to get help with this issue, but he was told the reason this was happening was due to mental illness or repressed anger. After being told this, he wouldn't get any more help. Once he became an adult, he would move back to his parents' house, and while living there, he accused his mom of trying to poison him. Because of his false accusations towards his mother, Chase's father decided to buy his son his own apartment. After moving in, Chase would have multiple different roommates, which all claimed that he had acted strange when they were living there. He eventually started living alone, and once this began, he started killing animals again. However, this time, he started eating and blending up animals raw. In 1976, he was taken to the hospital after he inserted rabbit blood into himself. During his time at the hospital, the different patients and staff began calling him Dracula due to him drinking animal blood. Around a year later, in 1977, Chase would be caught naked in a field in Lake Tahoe, Nevada. He had killed a cow and began smearing himself in its blood. The police wouldn't do anything about it. Unfortunately, shortly after this, Chase began going after people. He would be involved in a drive-by, and during it, he shot and killed Ambrose Griffin, who was helping his wife bring in groceries. He was an engineer and only 56 at the time of his death. Police would investigate, and Chase would get away with this killing. His next victim would be 22-year-old Teresa Wallen, who was 3 months pregnant at the time. January 23rd, 1978, Chase would be walking around the neighborhood that Wallen lived in and was testing doors to see if they were unlocked. Once he arrived at the Wallens' home, he tested the door and it was unlocked. He walked in and found Teresa taking out the trash and threatened her with the gun. He shot her twice, once in the palm and the other at the top of her head. As soon as she fell to the ground, he fired another shot into her temple. Chase began to remove her organs and started smearing her blood all over himself and all over the home. He had also used an empty yogurt container to drink her blood and stuffed animal feces in her mouth. Her husband, David, would come home from work to discover this horrific crime scene. Using evidence from the scene, police would be able to determine a description of the killer. This description was a match to Chase, but police did not know who Richard was at the time. On January 27th, Chase would murder his last victims. Chase would once again enter a home, where inside he would take the lives of 36-year-old Evelyn Miroth, her son, 6-year-old Jason Miroth, Daniel Meredith, who was a family friend, and Michael Ferreira, who was Evelyn's 22-month-old nephew that she was watching at the time. Later, a cardboard box that contained Michael's remains was found in a church parking lot. The crime scene would be similar to Wallen's crime scene, which linked the two murders together. This time, however, Daniel's red station wagon was missing. However, it would soon be found abandoned not far from Evelyn's home. Police were desperate to look for this killer before he struck again, and they began asking people if they had seen someone who matched the description of the killer. The police found 2 suspects they believed that had been driving the station wagon, but they were proven innocent. Eventually, a woman in her late 20s would make a report to police, saying that someone she went to high school with came up to her and tried to open her car door. When asked the identity of this individual, she said it was Richard Chase. Police found the apartment he was living in and waited for him to come out. He would eventually open his door and begin running to his truck. Luckily, police were able to detain him. His apartment was littered with blenders that contained blood, dirty clothes, and a container that had human brain tissue. His trial would begin in 1979, and Chase pleaded not guilty due to reason of insanity. However, he was proven to be sane when he was committing the murders and was found guilty on 6 counts of murder and given the death penalty. While in prison, though, he began receiving medicine, but instead of taking it, he stored all of it in his cell, and on December 26, 1980, he would be found dead in his cell. It's the morning of April 20th, 1989, and a corpse is lying in Central Park. The identity of the body was a 28-year-old woman named Trisha Malilly, and she had been severely beaten and raped. Once she was taken to the hospital, it was revealed that she lost 75% of her blood, and she had a severe skull fracture. The result of her injuries left her in a coma for 2 weeks, and once she woke up, she didn't remember anything for the night she was attacked. Investigations would commence, and it turns out on the night of April 19th, Trisha decided to go on a run in Central Park, and that's when her horrifying attack began. She had been beaten with the rock, tied up, and then raped. Luckily, just within 5 days of the attack, police would be able to find 5 individuals who took part in this assault. Raymond Santana, who was 14, Antron McCray, Kevin Richardson, Yusuf Salam, who were all 15, and Corey Wise, who was 16, were all found to be connected to the assault. After interrogating all the teenagers, it was revealed they were part of a gang called the Wolf Pack. The group consisted of 30 teenagers, and they had committed the attacks on random people, like a taxi driver and another male jogger. Once they were caught, there was no remorse for the 5 teens. Multiple news articles were bashing the teens and giving them names like savages and animals. Even Donald Trump, who at the time was a real estate developer but would become America's 45th president, put out a headline and stated, "Bring back the death penalty, bring back our police." Just days after the attack, all 5 of the teens were arrested. In 1990, all 5 of the teens' trials would begin. The largest amount of evidence against the teens was that 4 out of the 5 of them confessed to committing the crime. However, according to Yusuf Salam, the night they were interrogated, they were not allowed food, water, or sleep for more than 24 hours. The teens claimed they were all forced to confess to the crime. More evidence against police would begin to build up. None of the teens' DNA was at the crime scene, and there was no witnesses either. Despite the obvious lack of evidence, all 5 of them were found guilty. Salam, Santana, and McCray were found guilty of assault, rape, robbery, and riot. Richardson was convicted of rape, attempted murder, assault, and robbery, and Corey was convicted of assault, sexual abuse, and riot. Between all of them, they remained in prison from 6 to 13 years. However, in 2002, a serial rapist named Matthias Reyes, who was in prison, confessed that he assaulted Trisha. He took a DNA test, and it turns out that he was a match to the DNA at the crime scene, and on December 19th of that same year, the Supreme Court removed the charges from all 5 of them. The next year, all 5 of them would sue New York City for emotional distress, racial discrimination, and malicious prosecution, and by the end of it, New York would settle with them for $41 million, with each of them getting $1 million each year for how many years they were held captive. Luckily, all 5 men have been successful since they were released from prison, and in 2012, a documentary about the case was released. On the shelf lies one of the most well-known and beloved candies in Japan, Pocky Sticks. At the time, in the 1980s, the Asahi Glico Company was one of the most successful candy companies in Japan, having their products in multiple different stores. It was March 18th, 1984, and the company's president, Katsuyosa Ezaki, had arrived home after having a bad day at work. However, his day quickly improved after he saw his wife and 3 children waiting for his arrival. Later that night, Ezaki would turn on the water to his bathtub to settle down for the night. Next door, Ezaki's 70-year-old mother was also getting ready for bed when she heard someone barge into her home. She would look up in fear and dread as she saw 2 men wearing white ski masks approaching her, threatening her with guns. They would eventually restrain her by tying her up and demanding she tell them where the keys were to her son's house. Once she gave them the location of the key, the 2 men went to go invade Ezaki's home. Once they entered, they found Ezaki's wife and daughter, and they would tie them up. The 2 men were interested in finding Ezaki, and they eventually found him in the bath. Ezaki began yelling at the 2 to leave his home, but they threatened to harm the rest of his family if he didn't cooperate with them. Ezaki would be taken by the 2 men outside to their getaway car, and they would quickly flee the neighborhood. The next morning, police were at Ezaki's residence investigating the kidnapping. Their main goal was trying to find a motive for why the 2 men kidnapped Ezaki in the first place. However, police would soon discover a note that was left at a phone booth near the home. It was a ransom note, and it was demanding that the Glico Company pay 1 billion yen and give 220 pounds of gold bullion, which was worth around $1.3 million, to the kidnappers. On March 21st, 1984, who at this point had been held captive for 3 days, was trying to loosen the ropes he was tied up in. Luckily, he was successful and ran towards the door. Once he kicked it down, he began sprinting down the road and towards authorities. Once police began interrogating him on what happened, he said that the only injuries he was given were just a few scratches on his face, and he also believed that the 2 men were using fake guns. On April 10th, multiple vehicles at the Glico headquarters would be set aflame in the parking lot. Shortly after this, on April 16th, a plastic container that contained hydraulic acid in Ibaraki, which was the same city that Ezaki was held captive at. The individual or individuals who left this container also left a letter which demanded the company to give them money. Another letter would be sent out, but this time it was to the media. This letter stated, "To the stupid police, are you idiots? If you were pros, you would catch us. Because you guys have such a high handicap, we're gonna give you some hints." The hints that the letter included was that the getaway car was gray and they had purchased some food from a supermarket. The letter was signed by the monster with 21 faces. In May, the letters continued to be sent out to the Glico Company, police, and the press. These letters would be signed by the same people. The writer of these letters claimed to have laced the candy from the Glico Company with potassium cyanide, which can be lethal. Due to this, the company had to remove $21 million worth of products off store shelves, and they had to lay off over 1,000 employees. Soon after this devastating downfall, another fire would be set around a Glico building. A lead on the case was almost made when a man wearing a baseball cap and a business suit was caught on camera putting candy he brought on the shelves, which could have been tainted with poison. The video would be released to the public, but the identity of this man remains unknown and still to this day does. Like usual at this point, another letter would be discovered, but this time it was trying to make peace with the police and the press. The writer of this letter claimed they were bored of taunting the police and they were going to Europe to avoid the summer weather. However, the short amount of relief would be cut short when they started writing letters to different candy and food companies in Japan. One of the companies they were harassing now was Marodia. Soon after the harassment towards Marodia began, another letter would be sent out to the Glico Company, demanding if they paid them 50 million yen, which is worth around $250,000, they would stop harassing them. Glico would agree to this, and 2 days later, an undercover police officer, disguised as a Glico employee, would board a train to the meeting spot. The writer of this letter stated that the employees need to look for a white flag, and once he located it, he needed to toss the money off the train. This officer would soon notice a larger man with glasses and brown hair looking at him on the train. However, as the train ride was coming to an end, the officer didn't see a white flag, and he eventually got on another train to go back home. Once he returned home, he described the man on the train that was watching him, and he would be known to Japan as the Fox-eyed man. Soon after this, letters continued to be sent out, but this time, they contained around 30 grams of sodium cyanide, which if consumed, could kill an individual. In October of 1984, a letter that was addressed to Moms of the Nation claimed they laced the candy from a company called Morinaga. Police would begin searching the candy all over Japan, and they found that some of the candy was laced. The candy that had been laced had a warning sticker from the Mothra 21 Faces stating, "Danger, contains poison, you'll die if you eat this." Morinaga would have a 60% loss in sales due to this. Laced candy would be discovered over the next several months, and even into the next year. Police were still hunting after the Fox-eyed man during this time as well. Luckily for police, they would soon have their big break. A station wagon was found near a drop-off. A police officer would drive up to the car, and inside was a man who was estimated to be in his 40s. He was just sitting there doing nothing, but once the officer approached him, he sped off. Police would go on a hunt for the vehicle, and they found it abandoned not far from the original location. Further investigation revealed that the car had been stolen from another town, and inside was a police radio. The same harassment of police and multiple companies continued for the next several months, but finally on August 12, 1985, the Mothra 21 Faces would send out their final letter. The last line of the letter read, "We are bad guys. That means we've got more to do other than bullying companies. It's fun to lead a bad man's life." To this day, this case remains unsolved. The Hinterkaifeck farmstead was built in Bavaria, Germany in 1863 and was cared for by the Gruber family and had been passed down over time. By 1922, the farm was cared for by 63-year-old Andreas, his wife 72-year-old Kazilla, the couple's daughter 35-year-old Victoria, who was a single mom and raising her 2 children at the farm, which were 7-year-old Kazilla, which we will refer to her as C for the remainder of the video, and 2-year-old Joseph. Unfortunately, this family's home life was far from perfect. Andreas was known to have a very short temper, and he was abusive to his children and his wife. He was also proven guilty in court in 1915 of having a romantic relationship with Victoria. It has never been confirmed, but it is possible that Andreas was the real father of Joseph. What proves this accusation even further is Victoria stating, "That's the better thing, that I'm pregnant by father, otherwise he would beat me to death." It is possible that Andreas didn't want Victoria to get pregnant by any other man. In 1921, the family's maid at the time had to quit due to her hearing noises in the attic, which brought her to think that the house was haunted. In March of 1922, Andreas walked outside on his property and discovered a newspaper from Munich, Germany. Andreas was confused because he never bought that paper, but he figured that the mailman had simply just lost it. However, it turns out that none of Andreas's neighbors subscribed to that paper. A few more weird occurrences like this happened, like one of the keys to Andreas's farm going missing, and him discovering footprints in the snow that led from the forest surrounding the property to the machine room on the farm. The same night he discovered these footprints, the entire family heard footsteps in their attic. However, despite the multiple disturbing occurrences, Andreas declined any help from neighbors or police. On March 30th, 1922, Victoria had an argument with both her parents and decided to flee the farm. Luckily, she was found within hours of running away, but for some reason she was in the forest alone. The next day, Maria Baumgartner, who was hired to be the new maid of the home, arrived with her sister. As Maria walked up to the home, the furthest thing from her mind was the hell that she was going to experience in the next few hours. It's April 4th, and the farm sits in silence. That's the case until footsteps of a local mechanic named Albert Hoffner echo throughout the property. Hoffner had arrived to help repair an engine, but he quickly noticed the deafening silence of human life. He eventually decided to wait for someone to greet him, but after an hour, he decided to walk over to where the engine was and begin fixing it. After almost 5 hours, Hoffner finished the engine, and he had still not heard or seen anyone. The only living thing around him was just farm animals. But since his work was finished, Hoffner left the property. Just a few hours later, at 3:30 p.m., 16-year-old Johann and his stepbrother, 9-year-old Joseph, are headed to the Hinterkaifeck farm after their father, Lawrence Schlittenbauer, sent them to try to find the family. After arriving and looking around, the boys realized the family was absent and returned home to tell their father. Once his sons told him about their visits, Lawrence decided he was going to travel to the farm with 2 other men named Michael Pohl and Jacob Siegel. The 3 of them went into the barn, and inside they found the bodies of Andreas, Kazilla, Victoria, and C. Joseph and Maria would be discovered in the home shortly after. Police would arrive, and a calendar that showed April 1st would prove that the family were murdered on March 31st. Police theorized that the killer might have ripped the page off the calendar that had March 31st on it. On April 5th, all of the bodies were taken to a physician named John Aumler. After analyzing all of them, he determined the murder weapon was something called a mattock. A mattock is a tool that is similar to a pickaxe. Unfortunately though, police weren't able to confirm this for now, since they couldn't find the weapon at the crime scene. Victoria and Kazilla had multiple holes in their skulls from the weapon. Victoria also had a broken jaw. Andreas' cause of death was from falling onto the tip of the weapon, which caused him to bleed out. Maria and Joseph were also murdered with the weapon. Before her death, the killer had sexually assaulted C. It was also found that she had begun ripping out clumps of her own hair, which means that she was still alive even after the massacre. Police began hunting for answers on who was responsible for this horrific crime scene. A farmer named Simon Rayblender said he was driving home on April 1st at around 3 in the morning when he saw 2 figures standing by the road. As he drove by, they quickly turned the other way. Police theorized the reason for the massacre was a robbery, but after looking through the house, they found a large amount of money, which disproved this theory. Luckily, police discovered the weapon in the kitchen of the home, which turned out to be a mattock. Further investigation of the property revealed that someone had been living in the farm's hayloft, which is a spot where hay is stored. Carpets had also been placed along the floor to prevent footsteps from being heard. The intruder had also placed rope on some of the beams in the farm to climb down if they needed to escape. Police began listing potential suspects, and their first one would be Victoria's ex-husband, Carl Gabriel. However, there was only one small, tiny little issue, and it was that he died in World War I in December of 1914. However, the reason he was brought up as a potential suspect was because his body was never found, so it wasn't officially confirmed that he was deceased. Years later, after World War II, German captives claimed that a Soviet officer who spoke German claimed that he committed the murders. However, this lead would not go any further. Police would begin questioning their second suspect, which would be Lawrence. Victoria and Lawrence were potentially in a relationship. Lawrence drew even more suspicion when it was discovered that all the doors were locked when they went to look for the family on April 4th, but somehow he had a key and unlocked one of the doors and went inside by himself. Lawrence defended himself by saying he went inside to go look for Joseph, but it was confirmed that he had messed with the crime scene. He looked even more guilty after one of the keys to the home went missing days before the massacre, but it was thought that if Victoria and him were in a relationship, he could have been given a key from her. A year after the murders in 1923, the Hinterkaifeck farmstead was demolished, leaving no evidence of anything being there. In 1925, a teacher named Hans Volblager spotted Lawrence standing where the farmstead once stood. Hans approached Lawrence and asked him why he was standing there. Lawrence, ignoring the question, stated that whoever killed the family tried to bury the bodies, but was prevented due to the ground being frozen. Locals were confident that Lawrence was the killer, but this was never confirmed because in 1941, Lawrence would pass away. There were multiple other suspects and theories, but they all led to nowhere. One of the former maids for the family, named Crescence Rieger, claimed that a man named Anton Beechler could be the killer. He had helped the family with their potato harvest, and according to Rieger, said the family ought to be dead. She also said the family had a dog that always barked at strangers, but for some reason never barked at Anton. She said that his brother Carl could have been on it, and someone else who used to work at the farm named Georg Siegel. He was accused of breaking into someone's home in November of 1920, but he denied it, and to this day it still isn't fully confirmed. Siegel was also aware that there was money in the Gruber family home when he worked there. Another theory is that Andreas might have killed his family due to his aggressive behavior, but again, this was never proven. To this day, despite multiple theories and suspects, the individual responsible for this crime still remains unknown, and the place where the farmstead once stood lay a memorial, but recently, in August of 2022, the memorial was removed, and now all that remains is empty farmland.